Welcome to my channel Midnight Stories, where you find horror stories that scare you. Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. The decision to hike alone in the remote wilderness was not one I made lightly. As a former park ranger, I knew the dangers that lurked in the vast forests that stretched for miles in every direction. But after losing my wife to cancer 6 months prior, I desperately needed an escape from the suffocating grief that filled every corner of our home. With my old ranger pack loaded up with supplies, I set off from the deserted trailhead under a gray October sky. The ponderosas towered overhead, their orange bark peeling away to reveal dark furrows. Pungent scents of pine and damp earth filled my nostrils as my boots crunched through the thick carpet of russet needles. Despite the season, a heaviness hung in the air, an oppressive stillness broken only by the occasional caw of a raven. Beads of sweat formed on my brow from the unexpected humidity. With each step taking me further from civilization, an inexplicable sense of unease began to build in my gut. After a few miles, I paused for a swig from my canteen. That's when I noticed them, a set of unusual tracks in the soft dirt just off the path. They looked canine, but much too large to belong to a coyote or wolf. The splayed toes and elongated claws looked almost grotesquely human-like. A sudden chill raced down my spine, and I cast a wary glance at the dense foliage pressing in on either side of the trail. For the first time, I felt keenly aware of how isolated I was out here. Shaking off the ominous feeling, I forged ahead, eager to make it to my planned campsite before dusk. But I couldn't shake the impression that I was being watched. The forest seemed to grow quieter with each mile, the usual chorus of bird calls and skittering of small animals fading into a sepulchral silence. It felt as if the trees themselves were holding their breath, waiting. As the light began to wane, throwing long shadows across the path, a flicker of movement caught my eye off to the right. I whipped my head around, scanning the trees for any sign of life. But there was nothing, just the motionless trunks and the dying light. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I quickened my pace as true darkness began to gather, fighting the urge to glance over my shoulder with every step. The forest that had once been my place of solace now felt alien and sinister in the fading light. Relief washed over me as my campsite finally came into view, but even as I shed my pack and began to make camp, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was no longer alone in this wilderness. The next morning dawned crisp and cool, the night's humidity burned away by a weak autumn sun. I emerged from my tent, muscles aching from the previous day's hike. As I stood stretching my back, a flash of white amidst the fallen leaves caught my eye. Wandering over, I crouched down to examine the disturbance more closely. It was another set of those strange tracks, even larger and more defined than the ones I'd seen on the trail. The imprint looked to be at least 8 inches long. No normal wolf could have made it. An involuntary shudder ran through me as I studied the print. There was something distinctly off about the splayed toes, the way they were too long and almost thumb-like. I knew of no animal that left tracks like these. Unnerved, I began to break down camp, throwing furtive glances at the tree line as I worked. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. By the time I'd packed up, my nerves were completely frayed. I practically fled down the trail, not even pausing when the path branched off toward the scenic overlook I'd planned to take in. All I could think about was putting distance between myself and those tracks. After a half-mile of rushed hiking, I was startled by a human voice calling out through the trees. "Hail, Ranger!" The voice belonged to a grizzled old man emerging from the forest to my right, a battered hiking staff in hand. "What brings you out to these woods?" Something about his sudden appearance and familiar tone set my teeth on edge, but I found myself answering automatically. "Just doing some solo camping. Needed to clear my head." The old man leaned on his staff, examining me with knowing eyes. "Best be careful out here alone. These trees hold more than peace and solitude." A chill crept up the back of my neck at his words. "What do you mean?" He glanced around almost furtively before replying. "Old spirits dwell in places like this, spirits that don't take kindly to careless intrusion. Watch where you walk and listen when the forest talks. You'd best hope it doesn't take notice of you." With that ominous warning, he He turned and melted back into the trees as suddenly as he'd appeared. I stood rooted to the spot, my mind spinning. Spirits? It? What was the old man talking about? I forced myself to start walking again, but his words echoed in my head with each step. The day suddenly felt colder despite the sun climbing higher overhead. A distant bird call sounded from the canopy above, but something about it made me pause. There was an almost human-like quality to its tone, a mocking edge that raised goosebumps on my arms. When a bush rustled to my left a moment later, I leapt nearly a foot in the air. A large raven burst out of the foliage and took to the sky with a raucous cry. But in the split second before it unfurled its wings, I could have sworn its black eyes held an all-too-intelligent gleam. Pulse pounding, I forced myself to continue down the trail, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone in the forest. It felt as if the trees had eyes, my every movement tracked by some malevolent force. I found myself longing for the easy camaraderie of my ranger days, for the comfort and safety of other humans. Out here in the wilderness, I was utterly alone, and with each passing minute, that isolation began to feel more and more like a trap. By late afternoon, I was hopelessly lost. In my haste to put distance between myself and the strange tracks and unsettling raven, I'd veered off my planned route. The trees pressed close on all sides, ancient pines towering over thick understory. The air felt heavy and oppressive, burdened with a sense of foreboding. I consulted my compass with shaking hands, but the needle spun lazily, refusing to settle on a direction. It was as if some force in the forest was interfering with the device. Fighting down my rising panic, I tried to get my bearings from the sun, but the thick canopy obscured the sky. As I stood there, paralyzed by indecision, a piercing cry rang out in the distance. It sounded like a woman's scream, echoing through the trees. I whirled around, trying to pinpoint the source, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then, from a different direction, came what sounded like a child sobbing. The hair on the back of my neck stood straight up. There was something profoundly unnatural about the sounds, a mocking quality that I couldn't place. I spun in a slow circle, my heart in my throat as I scanned the trees for any sign of the criers. But the forest was deathly still, not even a breeze stirring the pine boughs. Another scream rang out, this one even closer. And then, a man's agonized shout. They sounded like people being tortured, the cries bouncing off each other until the forest rang with a hellish cacophony. But beneath the very human sounds of pain and fear, there was an undercurrent of something else. A rasping, inhuman quality that set my teeth on edge. I clapped my hands over my ears, trying to block out the awful noise, but it was inside my head now, reverberating in my skull. Tears streamed down my face as I stumbled blindly through the trees, desperate to escape the auditory onslaught. I nearly sobbed with relief when I suddenly broke through a line of trees into a small clearing. The screams cut off abruptly, leaving me in a silence that was almost worse. My ragged breathing was loud in my ears. As I stood there, trembling and disoriented, my gaze fell on a large boulder on the far side of the clearing. Something was carved into the weather-beaten surface of the stone. I took a hesitant step closer, dread settling heavily in my stomach. It was an old Forest Service sign, the paint faded and peeling, but I could still make out the words, "Danger, Bear Attack, May 8, 2015, T. Wexler, B. Harper, S. Raminsky's missing, presumed dead. Area closed until further notice." I stared at the sign, horror dawning as the names sank in. I knew those people. They'd been rangers, colleagues of mine. All three had disappeared on a routine patrol 7 years ago, never to be seen again despite an extensive search. Cold sweat beaded on my forehead as I backed away from the boulder, my mind racing. If this was where they'd vanished, what did that mean for me? I cast a panicked look at the sky, realizing night would soon be falling. The thought of being in the woods after dark, with the screams and some sinister force stalking me, was unbearable. But I was utterly turned around, with no clue which way led back to civilization. I'd have to make camp here and try to survive the night. With shaking hands, I unslung my pack and started to set up my tent. But even as I went through the motions, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the tree line, waiting. As full darkness fell, I huddled inside my tent, jumping at every nighttime noise filtering through the nylon walls. The usual sounds of insects and nocturnal birds were eerily absent, leaving an oppressive silence broken only by the hammering of my heart. Despite my exhaustion, sleep proved elusive. Every time I started to drift off, a twig would snap or leaves would rustle outside the tent, jerking me back to terrified wakefulness. The screams from earlier echoed in my head, mingling with the old ranger's ominous warning until I questioned my own sanity. Around midnight, a new sound joined the nighttime symphony, a low, guttural breathing that seemed to circle the tent. With each circuit it grew louder, until I could practically feel the hot exhalations against the fabric. My stomach turned as a sour, carrion-like stench filled the air. I desperately fumbled for my flashlight, but it wouldn't turn on despite the new batteries I'd installed at the trailhead. Outside, heavy footsteps crunched through the dry leaves, circling closer with every ragged breath. I fought the urge to scream, clamping my hand over my mouth. Tears streamed down my face as I curled into a ball, trying to make myself as small as possible. The steps paused near my head, so close I could hear a low snuffling as something scented the air. An inhuman whine cut the silence, raising every hair on my body. An eternity seemed to pass as I waited for the creature to make its move, for claws to tear through the flimsy tent walls. But after a few endless minutes, the sound of its breathing faded as it moved off into the night. I lay there shaking, not daring to move a muscle lest I draw it back. At some point I must have drifted into an uneasy sleep, because I jolted awake in the gray light of pre-dawn. It took me a moment to place the sound that had woken me, a voice calling my name from outside the tent. "John? Johnny, are you in there?" The bottom dropped out of my stomach as I recognized my wife's voice. It couldn't be. It was impossible. She was dead. I'd scattered her ashes over the lake just 6 months ago. "Honey, please let me in. It's so cold out here." Her voice drifted through the nylon, achingly familiar yet not quite right. Images of her emaciated body in the hospital bed flashed through my head. I squeezed my eyes shut, clamping my hands over my ears. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But the voice continued, taking on a pleading, desperate edge. "John, why did you leave me? Why did you let me die? I'm so hungry, so cold. Please let me in." A ragged sob escaped my throat as I tried to block out the horrible mimicry of my dead wife's voice. I knew that if I looked, if I opened the tent, I would find something horrible wearing her face. I don't know how long I lay there as the thing begged and pleaded. But eventually, as the first light of dawn seeped through the tent walls, the voice faded away, leaving me spent and shaking. When I finally found the strength to move, I was appalled to see the chaos inside the tent. My clothes and supplies were strewn everywhere, as if something had rifled through them while I huddled in my sleeping bag. A numb kind of terror filled me as I realized how close the creature must have come while I slept. With fumbling hands, I gathered my scattered gear, shoving it haphazardly into my bag. I had to get out of these woods as far and fast as possible, but as I emerged from the tent, I froze at the sight that greeted me. The clearing was filled with those unnatural tracks from the day before, dozens of them circling my campsite like a target. Some primal instinct screamed at me to run, that I was being hunted by something far beyond my understanding. I didn't even bother to break down the tent. I simply grabbed my pack and fled into the trees, my wife's mocking cries still echoing in my head. I crashed through the underbrush in sheer panic, branches whipping my face and tearing at my clothes. All thoughts of path or direction were lost in my primal need to escape the thing that stalked me. The forest blurred around me as I ran in what felt like circles, gulping lungfuls of the thick, oppressive air. My heart hammered against my ribs, every rustle of leaves and snap of twigs sending fresh jolts of adrenaline through my veins. I sensed the creature was nearby before I saw or heard it. The birds and insects fell deathly silent, the air itself seeming to grow heavy and watchful. I skidded to a stop, scanning desperately for a hiding spot or avenue of escape. That's when I noticed another one of those grotesque tracks sunk deep into a patch of mud. But this print was different from the others. Rather than a mutated wolf track, this was a human footprint. A man's bare foot, almost comically large. The splayed toes were much too long, the arch impossibly high. I stared at it in horror, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. A guttural growl shattered the silence behind me, and I whirled to see a huge black shape moving through the trees. It was like no animal I'd ever encountered. Shaggy fur covered a body that seemed to shift and flow as it prowled closer, muscles rippling under bristling haunches that narrowed to an almost emaciated waist. But it was the eyes that paralyzed me. Red-rimmed and glowing with a feral light, they held an awful intelligence as they locked onto my frozen form. I saw madness and hunger in those eyes, a predatory gleam that turned my bowels to water. The creature stalked closer, lips peeling back to reveal jagged yellow fangs that had no place in a wolf's mouth. A keening whine built in its throat, rising to an almost human-like scream that shattered the forest calm. That sound jolted me from my paralysis, and I turned to run, but the creature was too fast. In one fluid bound, it leapt into my path, hackles raised and jaws slavering. I backpedaled in terror, boots tangling in a carpet of dead leaves. My hand closed around a sturdy branch, and I swung wildly as the thing lunged. I felt the solid thunk as wood connected with flesh and bone, heard an eerily human cry of pain. Then I was running again, crashing blindly through the trees as the creature's furious howls receded behind me. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, collapsing against the mossy trunk of a fallen tree. For long minutes I lay there panting, ears straining for any sound of pursuit, but the forest was utterly silent. With a groan, I pushed myself up to a sitting position. As I did, I felt a stab of pain in my side. Startled, I reached down to feel a warm wetness soaking my shirt. When I pulled my hand away, it was slick with blood. In my panicked flight, I hadn't even registered the creature's claws raking my ribs. Now, as the adrenaline faded, the pain hit me in nauseating. With trembling fingers, I peeled back the shredded remnants of my shirt to examine the wound. 3 jagged furrows scored my right side, oozing blood. The gashes were deep but didn't appear to be immediately life-threatening. Still, the sight of my torn flesh brought home the reality of my situation with sickening clarity. I was badly injured, lost in the wilderness, and being hunted by something straight out of a nightmare. A choked sob escaped my throat as the hopelessness crashed over me. No, I couldn't give in to despair, not while I still had strength left to fight. Gritting my teeth against the pain, I pushed myself to my feet and took stock of my surroundings. That's when I noticed the structure through the trees. An old cabin, half obscured by the encroaching forest. Its walls were gray and weathered, the roof sagging, but it looked blessedly solid compared to the horrors outside. Hardly daring to hope, I stumbled toward the refuge. Up close, the cabin was in even worse shape than I'd first thought. The windows were boarded up, the front steps rotted through, but the door was intact, and miracle of miracles, unlocked. With a last fearful glance over my shoulder, I slipped inside. The interior was shrouded in cobwebs and shadows, lit only by thin shafts of light filtering through gaps in the boards. Dust motes swirled in the musty air, and I had to cover my mouth to stifle a cough. But it was shelter. As my eyes adjusted, disturbing details emerged from the gloom. Deep gouges scored the floorboards, some splintered clear through. Mud and bits of leaves caked the floor in a trail leading to a back corner, and there, piled against the far wall, a mound of backpacks, clothing, boots, all tattered and stained with old blood. My heart plummeted as the realization sank in. This was no mere abandoned cabin. It was the creature's lair, a place to bring its prey. The rucksacks and gear must have belonged to past victims, hikers who'd fallen into the same trap as me. With shaking hands, I rooted through the grisly pile, both dreading and needing to know what I'd find. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect: moldering camping equipment, shredded coats, empty cans of food. But buried at the bottom, I unearthed something that made my blood run cold. An old journal, the pages swollen with moisture and stained with substances I tried not to think about. Hands trembling, I cracked the cover and began to read. The cramped, frantic handwriting told a story of mounting horror. The journalist, a hiker named Abigail, described experiences chillingly similar to my own. The sense of being watched, the unnatural tracks, the monstrous creature stalking her through the trees. But it was the final entry that sent icy tendrils of fear curling in my gut. In shaky script, Abigail described a Native American myth passed down by the local tribes, the tale of the Skinwalker, an evil shaman who could take the form of any creature, wearing their skins like grotesque costumes, a being of pure malevolence that hungered for human flesh. Abigail's writing deteriorated into a scrawl at this point, as if her hand could barely keep pace with her terrified thoughts. The Skinwalker was hunting her, she wrote. It had taken the form of a bear, an owl, her own best friend. There was no escaping it, no fighting it. It would devour her, body and soul. The final words sent chills racing down my spine. If you're reading this, run. Don't look back, don't stop, just run, or it will consume you too. I dropped the journal as if it had burned me, heart pounding. My eyes darted to the boarded-up windows, the shadows beyond. Was the creature out there even now, wearing a new skin, waiting for me to emerge? I had to get out of here. Journal and warning be damned. I couldn't just sit here like a rat in a trap, waiting for the Skinwalker to come for me. Steeling myself against the pain in my side, I heaved to my feet and crept toward the door. But when I tried the knob, it refused to turn. I rattled it desperately, throwing my shoulder against the wood, but it was no use. The door that had opened so easily before was now stuck fast, trapping me inside. As realization dawned, a scream of hopeless rage tore from my throat. The Skinwalker had lured me here, herded me like a sheep to slaughter, and now the creature had me exactly where it wanted me, wounded, cornered with no way out but death. I don't know how long I huddled in that dark cabin, jumping at every creak of settling wood, every skitter of claws in the walls, minutes, hours, an eternity. Time lost all meaning as I waited for death to come for me. When a floorboard groaned directly outside the door, I didn't even have the strength to lift my head. By then, a numb sort of acceptance had settled over me like a shroud. There was no escape, no fighting this thing. All I could do was hope it would be quick. Yellowed teeth bared in a mockery of a grin as the monster shouldered through the door. In the half-light, its form seemed to flicker and shift between wolf and man and nightmare. Matted fur gave way to mottled flesh, then back again. But it was the eyes that riveted me. Hellish red, glowing with a foul intelligence, they pinned me with a gaze that stripped me to the bone. I felt flayed open, all my secrets and fears laid bare before that pitiless stare. The thing stalked closer, its shape unfolding and flowing in ways that defied comprehension. The stench of decay strengthened until I gagged on it, eyes watering. But still I couldn't look away. "Why?" I croaked, despair and incomprehension making my voice crack. The creature hesitated, head cocking like a dog hearing a far-off sound. When it spoke, the voice was a hollow rasp that raised every hair on my body. Hunger, always hunger. Those two words, more than the fangs or claws or impossible warping of flesh, broke something deep inside me. Some last desperate thread of hope that this was all a nightmare, that I might wake up safe in my bed. But this was no dream. The thing before me was terribly, viscerally real, and it would rip me apart and devour me as it had so many others to sate its endless hunger. I bowed my head, a tear tracing through the grime on my cheeks. "Just make it quick." A broken whisper. The Skinwalker made a low sound, almost a purr. Then, to my horror, its form rippled and changed. Pelt smoothed into pale skin, muzzle flattened into a too-wide mouth. Taloned limbs lengthened and straightened. My wife's face smiled back at me, beautiful and terrible. Her hazel eyes gleamed with a feral light, even as they brimmed with mock tenderness. "Oh, my love," the thing crooned in her voice. "It will never be over quickly. You will be sustenance for a long time." Those awful words galvanized something deep within me, an ember of defiance buried beneath the layers of exhaustion and despair. I would not let this thing wear my love's face, defile her memory. If I was going to die, it would be fighting. As the creature reached for me, I surged up from the floor with a wordless roar. My hands scrabbled desperately, finding a jagged length of wood from the shattered floorboards. I swung with every ounce of my remaining strength. The Skinwalker howled as the impromptu club connected, an eerily human sound of pain and rage. I felt the crunch of breaking bone, saw blood fly in an arc of black droplets. But the thing barely staggered, its form melting back into a writhing mass of fangs and fur. I swung again and again, aiming for the hellish eyes, the gaping maw. Claws raked my arms, my face, but I felt no pain, only a grim determination to fight until my last breath. In the end, it was an errant swing that saved me. The wood connected with one of the boarded-up windows with a resounding crack. Rotted wood gave way in an explosion of splinters, and suddenly, impossibly, light flooded the cabin. The Skinwalker shrieked, flinching back from the illumination as if burned. In that moment of distraction, I heaved forward with the last of my strength, shoving past the recoiling form. Then I was out, running across the clearing on legs that barely held me. I could feel the creature at my back, hear its thundering steps, but I didn't dare look back. If I looked back, I was dead. I plunged into the trees, staggering and clawing my way through the underbrush. Branches whipped my face, snagged my clothes, but I barely felt them. All that mattered was putting distance between myself and the monster, one leaden footfall at a time. At some point I realized the sounds of pursuit had faded. I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw only the forest, still and silent. No mutated shadow moving among the trees, no glowing red eyes boring into my soul. I collapsed against a tree trunk, every muscle trembling with exhaustion. The adrenaline that had sustained me drained away, leaving me dizzy and hollow. I glanced up at the lightening sky, glimpsed patches of dawn gray through the canopy. Somehow, impossibly, I'd made it through the night. The Skinwalkers' hunting ground. But even as desperate relief flooded me, I couldn't shake the feeling that my narrow escape was only a temporary reprieve. The journal's warning echoed in my head. There is no escaping it, no fighting it. It would devour me, body and soul. Shuddering, I pushed away from the tree and stumbled onwards through the lightning gloom. I shambled through the woods in a daze, numb to the cold and my injuries. My mind felt as battered as my body, barely clinging to sanity. I kept seeing my wife's face on that thing, hearing its howls and screams. I don't think I'll ever stop hearing them. At some point I realized the trees were thinning, giving way to scrub brush and tumbled rocks. For a heart-stopping moment, I wondered if I was just wandering deeper into the Skinwalker's domain. But no, there, a break in the foliage, a ribbon of worn dirt, the hiking trail. Sob catching in my throat, I staggered toward that blessed path. If I could just get back to the trailhead, back to civilization. But even as the thought formed, I knew it was a hollow hope. There was no going back, not really. The Skinwalker had taken something from me, something I'd never get back. The hike out passed in a blur of pain and exhaustion. I kept my eyes glued to the path, too afraid to look at the trees pressing close on either side. Every rustle of leaves, every flicker of shadow, set my heart racing anew. I felt watched, hunted, even in the light of day. When I finally limped into the parking lot, it was bustling with activity. Rangers, police, a crowd of worried-looking hikers. I must have been a sight, torn and bloody, eyes wild. People gasped when they saw me, rushed forward to help. Someone shouted for a medic. I fended off the reaching hands, the barrage of questions. I couldn't tell them, couldn't relive those awful hours in the telling. They'd think I was insane. Hell, maybe I was. I let them bundle me into an ambulance, sat numb and unresponsive as they tended my wounds. The police tried to question me, but I just shook my head. There were no words for what I'd seen, what I'd endured. In the days that followed, my body began to heal. The lacerations and bruises faded, the cuts scabbed over, but my mind... Some wounds go too deep to ever fully mend. I couldn't escape the feeling that a part of me was still out there, lost in those woods. That no matter how far I ran, the Skinwalker would always be with me, its foul taint clinging to my soul. I gave my statement to the Rangers as much as I could bear. Judging by their pitying looks, they put my ramblings down to trauma, exposure, maybe a bear attack. I didn't try to convince them. What good would it do? They could never understand the true horror of that place. The paper ran a small story about my ordeal, a cautionary tale about the dangers of hiking alone. But they got the details all wrong, sensationalized in the wrong ways. No one knew the truth, and God help me, I hope no one ever does. Because I think about the others, the ones who weren't as lucky as me. Abigail, the unknown hikers in that grim pile, were they still out there somewhere, lost in an endless nightmare? Or had the Skinwalker consumed them, as it had promised to consume me? I tried to put it out of my mind, to move on with my life. But in the dark of night, when sleep eludes me, I'll feel it. That prickling awareness, the sense of being watched by some malevolent presence. and I'll wonder if it's just my fractured psyche playing tricks. Or if, somewhere out there, the Skinwalker is biding its time, waiting to finish what it started, wearing a new skin, a familiar face, hungering for me still. The thought terrifies me, even as some dark part of me almost longs for it, because in those long watches of the night, I've come to a grim realization. The Skinwalker and I, we're bound now, two sides of the same foul coin. It's marked me, and I'll never be free of it, not really. I've stopped hiking, stopped traveling, stopped doing anything that might draw me back into its reach, but I know with a heavy and unshakable certainty that this isn't over, that one day I'll venture into the woods and never return. One day, I'll become just another ghost story, another campfire tale of the Skinwalker's insatiable hunger. Until then, I carry on as best I can, jumping at shadows and trying to lose myself in the mundane day-to-day. But when the wind howls through the trees, when the night presses close and full of teeth, I remember. And I know my fate stalks me still, waiting in the darkness, hungry, always so hungry. The sun hung low in the autumn sky as I set out on the trail, the air crisp with the promise of an early winter. Dried leaves crunched underfoot, echoing through the silent forest. It had been years since I last wore the park ranger uniform, but the well-worn hiking boots and weathered pack felt as familiar as ever. This was meant to be a solo journey of reflection and healing, a chance to reconnect with the wilderness that had once been my solace. The remote backcountry of the national forest seemed the perfect place to escape the chaos and heartache of the past year. But even in those first miles, something felt off. The usual chatter of birds and squirrels was eerily absent, the trees standing like stoic sentinels guarding long-held secrets. As dusk approached, I couldn't shake the uncanny sense of being watched. It prickled like ants crawling up the back of my neck. I scanned the dappled shadows between pine trunks and boulders, but caught no signs of wildlife or anything else. With nightfall nearing, I quickened my pace toward the first planned campsite, eager to escape the disquieting stillness that thickened with each step. If only I had recognized those subtle warnings for what they were, a premonition that I was walking into something beyond the realm of man and nature, something ancient and hungry. Dawn's light brought little comfort after a restless night spent tossing to the mournful songs of coyotes that almost sounded human. Unzipping the tent, my breath caught at the sight of tracks encircling my campsite. Canine prints, but far larger than any coyote or wolf. The depth and sharp edges spoke of immense weight and claws. Bipedal impressions led to and from the animal tracks, as if a person had been pacing alongside a monstrous beast. Perplexed and uneasy, I followed the trail until it disappeared into dense underbrush, only to emerge onto a forest road. An old pickup was parked there, a grizzled man leaning against the rusted tailgate. He greeted me with narrowed eyes and a grunt. "You'd best watch yourself out there," he said, spitting a dark stream of tobacco juice. "Folks gone missin' round these parts. Rangers couldn't find no trace, 'cept their packs all torn up." I asked if he knew what happened, but he just shook his head. "Ain't my business to speculate, but there's old stories, from the people who were here long before us white folk." His gaze cut to the tree line, where a flash of russet fur and moonlight eyes vanished into shadow. "Some things are best left alone." With those cryptic words, he climbed into his truck and rattled away, leaving me with a chill wholly disconnected from the warm sun on my face. I adjusted my pack and set off in the opposite direction, but couldn't resist a last look over my shoulder. Between the pines, a dark shape stood upright, tall and grotesquely thin, before blending into the dappled backdrop of foliage. By late afternoon, I realized I had veered miles off course, the trail an indistinguishable ribbon winding into uncharted backcountry. The canopy pressed close overhead, blocking the sun and any sense of direction. I consulted the topo map and compass to no avail. Landmarks failed to align with their printed counterparts. It was as if the forest itself had shifted around me. With light fading, I had no choice but to make camp in a small clearing flanked by towering firs. The silence was absolute, marred only by my own labored breaths and movements as I pitched the tent and built a fire. Its meager light held little sway against the encroaching darkness. A sudden ululation shattered the stillness, a long, undulating cry that could have been mistaken for a woman's wail, if not for the bestial undertones that made my skin crawl. Coyotes, I told myself, though I knew it was a lie. No animal I had ever encountered could make such a sound. Hunkered against a log, I poked at the weakening flames, straining eyes and ears for any sign of approach. There, a gleam of eyes in the periphery, there and gone between one blink and the next. Then another flicker, closer, accompanied by the crack of breaking branches. On instinct, I lunged for my pack, only to find the contents strewn across the dirt. Claw marks shredded the tough fabric, the water bottles punctured and leaking. Heart pounding, I snatched up the flashlight and zeroed in on a scrap of blood-stained cloth caught on a thorn bush. A bright yellow patch stood out against the dingy plaid, the same pattern I had seen adorning the packs of previous hikers. The beam jumped and wavered as my hands began to shake. "Who's there?" I meant to shout, but it came out as a strangled whisper. The fire sputtered and died, plunging me into inky blackness. From the void, my own voice echoed back, "Who's there? I'm lost. Help me." But layered beneath the words were sibilant whispers in a language I could not comprehend, ancient and rasping. A figure materialized at the tree line, body contorted in impossible angles, face shrouded. Something about its form seemed mutable, shifting even as I stared. Then it spoke again, this time with my mother's voice, saccharine and sing-song. "Come here, baby. Let me help you." I slammed my eyes shut and gripped the flashlight like a talisman. This wasn't real, couldn't be real. But when I looked again, the specter was gone, and in its place crouched a spindly, dog-like creature with ember eyes and too many teeth. I ran. Brambles snatched at my clothing, unseen rocks threatened to twist ankles, but I pushed on into the suffocating embrace of night. The thing behind me matched every desperate stride, its breath a damp heat on my neck. A little boy lost in the woods. It crooned in the orphan voice of a child. "How sweet, how sad. Let me put you out of your misery." I veered and stumbled through a dry creek bed, but could not shake my pursuer. Exhaustion burned in my lungs and legs, a dull counterpoint to the adrenaline icing my veins. The creature paced me, a pale blur streaking between the trees, never tiring. Sobbing, I burst into a meadow gilded silver by moonlight. At its center stood a ramshackle cabin, barely more than a shack. Dilapidated but standing, it represented my last hope for refuge. I threw myself at the weathered door, scrabbling for the handle, only to feel it give way under my weight. The reek of mildew and rotting wood enveloped me as I staggered inside and slammed the door behind me. In the darkness, I fumbled for my flashlight, sweeping its beam across the interior. A raw wooden table and chairs, a rusted stove, a sagging mattress. On the mattress sprawled a moldering pack, torn and stained. Hands quaking, I reached for it, dreading what I might find. The contents yielded a dented canteen, a shredded map, and a tarnished locket. The face inside, forever frozen in a blissful smile, was my own. But that was impossible. I had never been here, never worn such outdated clothes. Then I saw the initials on the battered tin. E.H., my great-grandfather Edward Hayes, a ranger in these parts some 60 years past, a man I had never met, but whose disappearance had haunted my family for generations. The cabin walls shuddered under a sudden impact. Through the gaps in the logs, lamplight eyes leered at me, accompanied by a guttural growl that resonated in my bones. The acrid stench of decay billowed from shadowed corners. "Join us," hissed a chorus of voices, young and old, male and female. Beneath floorboards something scraped and slithered. "It is your destiny." Destiny be damned. I had no intention of becoming another grim statistic, another Hayes who vanished without a trace. Bracing the door with a chair, I scoured the cabin for anything that could serve as a weapon. In the back of a battered cupboard, my hand closed around the solid weight of a hatchet, the handle silky with age and the blade edged in rust. It would have to do. From outside, the growls rose to a fever pitch, accompanied by the splintering of wood. They were trying to break in, to finish what they started with Edward all those decades ago. I positioned myself against the rear wall, eyes fixed on the door, waiting for the first sign of entry. But the attack came from below. The floorboards exploded upward in a shower of rotted wood, and a nightmarish form heaved itself into the cabin. In the guttering flashlight beam, I beheld a twisted mass of man and beast, fur and skin and writhing shadows. Antlers protruded from its skull, eyes like coal set in a face that shifted between human and animal, never quite settling. It lunged, faster than anything that size should move, and I swung the hatchet with all my strength. The blade connected, biting into mottled flesh, and the creature howled, an ungodly sound of rage and pain. Black ichor splattered the walls. Again and again I hacked and slashed, trying to fend off snapping jaws and razor claws that tore at my clothes and skin. We crashes through the door in a tangle of limbs, tumbling out into the moonlit meadow. The thing's form seemed to change with each blink, now a behemoth bear, now a spindly bipedal horror, now a grotesque amalgam of the two. It was as if it couldn't decide what to be, cycling through a catalog of predators. I scrambled backward, fumbling for the dropped hatchet, but clawed fingers snagged my ankle and dragged me into its clutches. Hot, fetid breath washed over my face as it pinned me to the ground. This was it. After all my struggles, I would die here alone at the hands of this impossible abomination. "Accept the gift," it rasped, muzzle peeling back to reveal rows of needle teeth. "Become one with the hunt." Eyes wide, I wrenched an arm free and blindly grabbed for anything within reach. A rock, a branch, something to bludgeon it with, but my fingers closed around something cold and metallic half buried in the dirt. A tarnished locket, twin to the one I'd found in the cabin. Edward's locket. Power surged through me at the contact, a crackle of energy that raced up my arm and burst from my eyes and mouth. I screamed, but it was my great-grandfather's voice that rang out, echoing across the meadow. "You cannot have him, beast. His spirit belongs to me." The creature recoiled with a shriek, flesh sloughing from its bones like melted wax. I staggered upright, thrusting the locket before me, and the monster dissolved into mist, leaving only the whisper of its malice on the wind. Silence reigned in the aftermath, broken only by my ragged gasps and the creak of settling logs. The cabin looked even more derelict from outside, its roof sagging and walls barely clinging to the frame. But with the creature temporarily banished and dawn still hours away, I had no choice but to seek shelter within. I stumbled across the threshold, sinking to the floor and cradling my throbbing head in my hands. The locket's chain was still wrapped in my fist, the metal warm to the touch. How had it ended up buried outside? What was the connection to my great-grandfather? Questions chased themselves in circles, finding no answers. Gingerly, I lifted the other locket from the musty bedding and held the two side by side. They were identical save for the initials, one bearing E.H. for Edward Hayes, the other T.H. My blood ran cold. Thomas Hayes had been Edward's brother and my great-great-uncle. Both rangers, both lost to the forest nearly a century apart. Hands shaking, I pried open Edward's locket, hoping for some clue or explanation. But the image inside was not the one I expected. Instead of a pretty girl or beloved relative, it showed a symbol, intricately carved, 3 spirals radiating from a central point, each tip adorned with a crescent moon. I had seen this before in the faded photograph of rangers that once hung in the station. The same symbol was stitched onto their breast pockets, partially obscured, but unmistakable. On a hunch, I peered closer at the torn pack on the bed, brushing away grime and cobwebs. There, beneath the mildew, was an identical emblem, and on the cracked leather cover of the journal wedged inside, the same triple spiral and crescent moons. Hands trembling, I opened the first page and read, "If you are holding this, then I have failed in my duties, both as a ranger and as a guardian. The cursed thing that hunts these woods is still free, stealing faces and sowing terror. I can only pray that my sacrifice will buy time for the next to take up the mantle. The locket is the key, forged with the blood and bone of our people. It is the only thing the beast fears. You must—" The rest was illegible, stained rusty brown with what could only be blood. I traced the symbol with a fingertip, a whirlwind of emotions churning in my gut. So this was my legacy, a long line of rangers sworn to protect the forest from an ancient evil, an evil that had claimed nearly all of us one by one, until only I remained. For a fleeting instant, anger flared bright and hot. I had never asked for this destiny, never wanted to be the inheritor of a doomed bloodline. But as quickly as it came, the rage guttered out, replaced by a grim resolve. Like it or not, This was my birthright, my duty, and I would be damned if I let that monster claim even one more life. Armed with the journal's fragmented knowledge and the power of the locket, I set out to confront the creature on my own terms. At first light, I retraced my steps to the original campsite, now little more than shredded nylon and scattered gear. The beast had been here, that much was clear, but where was it now? As if in answer, a twig snapped behind me, and I spun to face my tormentor. It crouched at the edge of the clearing, no longer bothering with any pretense of humanity. In the stark light of dawn, I could see it for what it truly was, a skinwalker, an abomination born of ancient magic and twisted desires. Its body was a patchwork of animal skins stitched together with sinew, stretched taut over a skeletal frame that seemed to shift and flow like quicksilver. "Foolish little ranger," it hissed, voice scraping like rusted blades. "You think that trinket can protect you? I have devoured 100 generations of your kind, and I will feast on 100 more." I stood my ground, one hand clutching the locket, the other wrapped around the hilt of a battered hunting knife found in Edward's pack. "Not this time," I growled back. "Your reign of terror ends here." The skinwalker lunged, a twisted mass of fangs and fur and flailing limbs. I slashed with the knife, catching it across the muzzle, and it reeled back with a shriek. Black blood spattered the leaves. But the wound sealed shut as I watched, flesh knitting together like liquid shadows. We clashed again and again, dancing between the trees in a deadly waltz. Claws raked my shoulder, teeth snapped at my throat. But the locket burned against my skin, a searing brand of protection, and each blow seemed to glance away at the last second, leaving me winded but unscathed. In contrast, every cut I landed on the beast sizzled and smoked, the silver in the blade anathema to its corrupted form. It staggered under the onslaught, steps growing heavy and labored. I pressed my advantage, herding it back against a massive oak. There would be no escape this time. "Yield, monster," I panted, leveling the knife at its heart, "or I will send you back to the hell that spawned you." The skinwalker crouched, muscles quivering, eyes rolling back to milky white. And then, to my horror, it began to change. Fur receded, limbs elongated, features rearranged themselves like clay under a sculptor's hand. In the space of a heartbeat, my mother stood before me, arms outstretched, tears glistening on her cheeks. "Please, baby, don't hurt me," she begged, and the knife wavered in my grip. "I'm so scared, I just want to go home." Anguish rose up to choke me, a lifetime of grief and longing. My mother was dead, I knew that. Had known it since I was a child, but oh, how I wished it wasn't so. How I ached to throw myself into those arms, to bury my face in her shoulder and breathe in the scent of her one last time. But even as the thought formed, cold metal seared my skin, jolting me back to cruel reality, the locket, the symbol of my duty, my vow. With a ragged sob, I lunged forward and buried the knife to the hilt in the skinwalker's chest. The glamour melted away, leaving only the beast, mouth agape in soundless agony. It shuddered once, twice, and then fell still, flesh crumbling to dust and blowing away on the morning breeze until nothing remained but a pile of yellowed bones and a tattered hide. I slumped to my knees, tears streaming down my cheeks, and let the knife slip from my numb fingers. It was over. After nearly a century of terror, the skinwalker was dead, its power broken at last. But the cost had been too high. Edward, Thomas, all the others who had fallen victim to its insatiable hunger. I wept for them, for the lives stolen and the loved ones left behind. In time, my tears dried, leaving behind a hollow sort of peace. I gathered the creature's remains and burned them on a pyre built from its own splintered bones, scattering the ashes to the four winds. Only when the last embers died did I turn my face toward home, the locket a comforting weight against my chest. The sun was setting by the time I reached the trailhead, painting the sky in strokes of crimson and gold. Had it only been a day since I set out on this fateful journey? It felt like a lifetime, like I was a different person altogether, forged anew in blood and fire and grief. I paused at the edge of the parking lot, breathing deep of the crisp pine-scented air. The forest looked different now somehow. Shadows stretched longer, colors seemed sharper, as if a veil had been lifted from my eyes, exposing the world for what it truly was. a place of beauty and terror, light and darkness, all tangled together in an endless dance. In the distance, a coyote howled, and I tensed reflexively before relaxing. Just a coyote, nothing more. The Skinwalker was gone, its power broken. But even as the thought formed, a flicker of unease churned my gut. The journal had hinted at other creatures, other evils that roamed these woods. Had the locket truly banished them all, or had it merely sent them scurrying back to their dens and burrows, waiting for the right moment to emerge once more? I shook my head, banishing the dark musings. Those were questions for another day, another ranger. My watch was ended, my duty discharged. It was time to hang up the uniform and try to pick up the pieces of the life I had left behind. But even as I reached for the truck's door handle, a sudden breeze gusted across the lot, carrying with it a familiar scent. Rotting leaves and old bones and something sickeningly sweet. A shadow detached itself from the tree line, tall and whipcord thin, eyes glinting like chips of obsidian. "Did you really think it would be that easy, little ranger?" The voice was a razor across my nerves, echoing from everywhere and nowhere. "I am the forest is me. Cut one head off, two more shall take its place." Ice flooded my veins, locking me in place. It wasn't possible, it couldn't be. But even as denial screamed in my head, the truth sank leaden claws into my heart. The Skinwalker was dead, but something far older and hungrier had taken its place. The shadow paced closer, form flowing like oil over water. "Your ancestors were thorns in my side for far too long, always interfering, always trying to stop the hunt. But now their protection is ended. No locket, no blood oath can save you. The last haze dies tonight." Despair crashed over me in a drowning wave. What hubris to think I could defeat such a thing. To think I could walk away, scars and all, and pretend the nightmare was over. There would be no escape, no return to normal. The forest had marked me, claimed me as it had all the others. The creature lunged, death in its eyes and hunger in its heart, and I dove headlong to meet it, a battle cry on my lips and an all-consuming rage in my soul. If I was to die, then let it be as a ranger, a guardian, a true haze. Let it be with honor and fury and fighting to my very last breath. In the gathering twilight, under a blood-streaked sky, we clashed, tooth and nail, fang and claw, and a hatred as old as time itself. The details blur and fracture, lost to pain and fear and the pounding of my pulse in my ears. All I know is that when it was over, I stood alone on the cusp of night, alive and whole, the taste of copper thick on my tongue. The creature lay broken at my feet, dissolving into mist even as I watched, its final taunts and curses borne away on the whistling wind. But I felt no triumph, no sense of victory, only a yawning emptiness, cold and vast as the void between stars, because I knew with a crushing certainty that it wasn't over, that it would never be over, not so long as the forest endured and the ancient evils within it stirred. So now I wander, rootless and restless, drawn ever back to the trees. By day I walk the trails, warning the innocent away from danger. By night I hunt the monsters in the shadows, matching fang for fang and fury for fury. It's a lonely existence, a twilight world caught between the realms of the living and the dead. But it's the only life I know, the only one that makes sense anymore, if it ever did. I am a haze, a ranger, a guardian of the wood, and I will fight until the day it finally claims me, bones and blood and weary, battered soul. Such is my legacy. Such is my curse. The deep wilderness called to me. As a park ranger, my job required regular solo treks into the most remote corners of the forest to check trails and ensure the land remained pristine. But this excursion felt different from the start. I set off at dawn, my pack heavily laden with gear and provisions to last several days. The morning fog draped the towering evergreens in an ethereal shroud, muffling my footfalls on the spongy earth. An unusual quiet enveloped the forest. No chirping birds, no skittering of small animals in the underbrush. Only stillness, as if the woodland creatures knew something I did not. The first few miles passed uneventfully as I followed a faded trail deeper into the old growth. Ancient hemlocks and Douglas firs stretched into the mist, their branches forming a knotted canopy that blocked the wan sunlight. Tendrils of unease crept up my spine, though I couldn't pinpoint the source of my apprehension. Something felt off in these primeval woods, a sensation of being watched by unseen eyes. I spun around, scanning the dim tangle of shrubbery and ferns, but saw nothing amiss. "Get a hold of yourself," I muttered, hitching my pack higher and soldiering on. As the day wore on, the uncanny sense of surveillance only increased. Shadows seemed to flit between the massive trunks, there one moment and gone the next. A heaviness permeated the dank air, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. The hairs on my nape prickled. I tried to shake off the unnerving feeling, attributing it to too many hours alone in the backcountry. Isolation could play tricks on the mind, but I couldn't suppress the trickle of dread as I pushed deeper into the wilderness, miles from any other living soul. My compass needle wavered erratically, first pointing north, then swinging wildly to the east. The device must be malfunctioning. I'd have to navigate by more traditional means, the sun's position, natural landmarks. Yet an uneasy shiver passed through me at the thought of losing my bearing out here, so far from civilization. By late afternoon, weariness settled into my bones. I needed to make camp before nightfall, but as I searched for a suitable spot to pitch my tent, a flicker of movement between the trees snared my eye. I squinted, pulse accelerating, but the shape vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Probably just a deer, I told myself, even as instinct screamed otherwise. No animal would linger with a human nearby. Unease blossomed into foreboding as I hastened to unpack my tent and supplies. The forest's eerie silence magnified every snap of a twig, each sigh of wind through the branches. Only when I crawled into my sleeping bag did I notice the print. A single paw impression in the loamy soil near my tent flap, far too large to belong to any species native to these woods. Icy fear gripped my heart as I stared at the track, trying to comprehend its size and shape. Something was out there, something that shouldn't exist, and it knew I was here. I barely slept that night, jumping at every noise filtering through the tent's thin nylon walls. Sibilant whispers seemed to curl on the edge of hearing, the wordless susurration sending chills down my spine. When dawn finally arrived, cloaking the forest in ashen light, I unzipped my tent with trepidation curdling my gut. A constellation of tracks surrounded my campsite, the same disturbing prints I had spotted the previous evening, paw-like but monstrously elongated and tipped with cruel claws. No animal I knew of left spoor like that. It resembled something canid, almost like an immense dog or wolf, but grotesquely distorted. Foreboding cramped my stomach as I examined the tracks. The beast must have circled my tent for hours, mere feet away as I huddled within the flimsy shelter. But why hadn't it attacked? The largest prints sank inches into the soft earth, suggesting a creature of tremendous size and power. I followed the unsettling trail with my eyes. It wandered between the behemoth trees, then vanished into the gloom of the deep woods. Every instinct screamed to turn back, to flee these tainted woods and the nightmarish thing that prowled them. But I had a job to do out here, a duty. I couldn't return to the ranger station with my tail between my legs, spouting wild tales of monster tracks. They'd think I'd lost my mind. Maybe I was overthinking this. Perhaps a wayward grizzly had passed through in the night, its prints distorted by the loamy soil. Reluctantly, I broke camp and hefted my backpack, the tracks burning into my mind's eye. The forest stretched before me, a primordial sea of misty green. Sunlight struggled through the woven canopy, casting weak shafts of illumination across the spongy carpet of pine needles and ferns. Shadows pooled between the enormous trunks, concealing anything that might lurk in their inky depths. My skin crawled with the unshakable certainty of being observed, tracked by some malevolent entity that skulked just out of sight. Ahead, the trail grew faint, eventually fading into nothing more than a narrow game path that even the resident deer seldom used. Tattered cobwebs veiled the spaces between branches, and fallen logs decomposed among thickets of bracken fern and salal. Few humans ever penetrated this far into the wilderness. As I pushed deeper into the ancient woods, the uncanny sense of being stalked only intensified. My ears strained for any unnatural rustle or footfall over the muted forest sounds. But only silence met my hearing, the air pregnant with hushed anticipation. Around midday, I stumbled into a small clearing, grateful for the mote of sunlight that dappled the glade. Crimson caught my eye, a large swatch of flannel fabric snagged on a blackberry bramble at the clearing's edge. Dread seized my heart as I untangled the cloth, revealing a torn, blood-stained shirt. The ragged wound in the fabric couldn't possibly have been made by a natural animal. It looked chewed, gnawed by powerful jaws. "You shouldn't be out here," a gruff voice startled me from behind. I spun to see a grizzled man in faded camouflage watching me from the tree line. A battered rifle hung at his side. Beneath a wild tangle of beard, his eyes were hard and piercing in a weather-beaten face. "Dangerous things in these woods," he warned cryptically. "Things that ain't quite animal, ain't quite human. Old things, dark things. They've been here long before us, and they don't take kindly to trespassers." A chill rippled through me at his ominous words. "What kind of things?" I asked, my voice emerging thin and thready. The old hunter shook his head, his gaze cutting away to the shadows between the behemoth tree trunks. "The kind you don't want to meet out here alone. The kind that can steal your face, your voice, and leave naught but bones behind." He turned back to me, eyes gleaming with something akin to pity. "Get out while you still can, boy, for they catch your scent." With that, he melted into the undergrowth, leaving me alone with the bloodied scrap of flannel and a rising sense of horror. I cast a final glance at the torn, gory fabric before dropping it like it had burned me. Then I saw it, half hidden in the ferny undergrowth at the clearing's border, a hulking shape crouched and beast-like, watching me with inhumanly intelligent eyes. Adrenaline jolted through my veins. I blinked and the thing was gone, leaving me to wonder if I'd imagined it, if my mind was playing hallucinatory tricks out here in the endless green. But deep in my marrow I knew the truth. I hadn't imagined it. Something was out there. The old man's words echoed in my head, feeding the icy dread coiling in my gut. They catch your scent. I had to keep moving, put distance between myself and whatever lurked in these woods. My legs carried me back to the trail of their own accord, and I plunged ahead, no longer certain where I was headed, only that I had to get away. Time warped in the emerald gloom of the forest's heart, minutes stretching into hours, hours into eternities. With rising panic, I realized I had lost my bearings, the trees crowding close on all sides in a disorienting maze. My compass spun lazy loops in my palm, refusing to point me to safety. Overhead, the wan light filtering through the canopy began to fade as evening stole through the woods. Soon, full dark would fall, and navigating the trackless wilderness would become nigh impossible. A distant howl floated between the tightened trunks, the eerie sound hovering in the darkening air. The back of my neck prickled. A wolf? Some corner of my brain rejected the idea. Wolves didn't range in this part of the forest, and that sonorous cry contained a disturbingly human quality, like a person screaming in anguish. I quickened my pace, my pack a leaden weight on my shoulders as I crashed through the thickening underbrush. Brambles clawed at my clothing with thorny fingers. Roots seemed to reach up to snag my boots, sending me sprawling into drifts of matted leaves. Overhead, an owl took flight on silent wings, drawing my eyes to a scrap of cloth dangling from a nearby branch. Bile scorched my throat as I recognized the fabric, a red bandana printed with twee kittens, the sort a child might wear. Dark stains marred the cheerful cloth. As I drew closer, fecal odors and the faint reek of putrefaction invaded my nostrils. Tattered shreds of tent nylon and a cracked backpack littered the small hollow. Desiccated bones poked from the awful smeared soil, far too small to belong to any animal. Icy horror expanded in my gut as I registered bite marks on the shattered femurs, gnaw marks made by powerful jaws. Dear God, some lost hiker, some hapless family had met their end here in this lonely forest, but no bear or cougar had feasted on their remains. That grim knowledge settled with leaden certainty in my bones. The sunset bled through the trees as I stumbled away from the grisly scene, fighting the urge to void the meager contents of my stomach. Wildly, I staggered in the direction I prayed led back to civilization, to safety and sanity beyond these shadowed boughs. Darkness fell with the finality of a furled shroud. Unseen things rustled in the undergrowth, the sounds somehow furtive and sly. The forest's gloom played tricks on my strained eyes, conjuring hulking shapes that lurched between the trees on malformed limbs. My headlamp's feeble beam penetrated only a few feet into the Stygian murk. Despair clogged my throat as I groped blindly through the night-dark woods. The trail was long gone, replaced by snarled vegetation determined to thwart me at every turn. My muscles burned with exhaustion, my stomach hollow with hunger I dared not sate, not here, not with the bones behind me and the lurking presence all around, invisible but palpably real. An eerie, undulating howl shivered through the trees, a sound that was not quite wolf, not quite human, but some ungodly admixture of the two. A chorus of yips and barks answered alarmingly nearby. Fear turned my innards to ice water as I fought my way through a dense copse of cedar saplings, their aromatic tang flooding my nose. At last I burst free of the clinging branches, staggering into a small clearing. My legs collapsed, pitching me to the needle-strewn earth. Above, the narrow slash of sky visible through the canopy twinkled with cold stars. Dimly, I knew I had to keep moving, that to linger here could mean death, but weariness had sunk hooks into my very marrow. Just a moment's rest, I told myself, already feeling my eyelids droop closed. Just a few minutes to gather my strength, and I would soldier on. As I drifted into uneasy oblivion, sleep overriding the adrenaline sizzling in my blood, a final thought chased me into the dark. Out here in the depths of the forest, no one would ever find me. Shrill, frenzied barking shattered the forest's hush, catapulting me from restless slumber. I bolted upright, scrabbling for my flashlight with tingling fingers, as my concussing heart lurched against my breastbone. The night pressed close, gravid with malice. The barks broke off, replaced by an eerie, modulated howl that ululated between the onyx trunks surrounding my pitiful camp. Trembling, I panned the flashlight beam across the clearing's perimeter. Twin amber eyes glinted in the undergrowth, there one moment and gone the next. Dear God, it was out there. It had found me. The uncanny howl sounded again, this time from the opposite side of the clearing. Despite the chill, sweat slicked my back. I spun, probing the impenetrable gloom, but the flashlight illuminated only ferns and branches. The howls came from all sides now, yipping and baying like hounds on the scent. Gooseflesh erupted along my arms. How many of the things were there? I couldn't see them, but I could feel their presence, the weight of their feral gazes heavy as a pall. They were toying with me, taunting me in the lightless pre-dawn, hurting me like mindless prey. A soft footfall at the edge of the clearing snapped my head around. I aimed the quavering beam at the source of the noise, my pulse a deafening drum in my ears. The light caught a flicker of dun fur, there and gone again between blinks. Werewolves. The thought streaked across my brain like a brand, searing and impossible. But I knew the truth of it in my marrow, undeniable as the moon overhead. All my life I had dismissed tales of lycanthropes and shape-changers as mere myth, the province of schlocky horror films and campfire tales. Now, hunted through an inky forest by unseen stalkers, myth took on the mantle of nightmarish reality. Another series of yips and howls erupted alarmingly close. I whirled, but not fast enough to catch more than an impression of a racing shadow. The things were circling me like sharks scenting chum, playing with their food. Panic seized me in jagged claws. I had to get away, to put distance between myself and the relentless predators before they tired of their macabre games. Wildly, I cast about for escape, a route of egress from this lightless death trap. There. The narrow entrance of what looked like a game trail, nearly invisible in the darkness. Scarcely daring to breathe, I crept toward it, wincing at every crackle of leaf litter beneath my boots. I almost made it, the promise of flight tightening my exhausted muscles. Then a dark shape materialized between the trailhead, blocking my path. Slowly it raised its lupine head, lips curling back to reveal yellowed fangs that glinted in my flashlight's wobbly beam. A shriek tore from my raw throat as I backpedaled, only to fetch up against something solid and warm. I spun. A massive man loomed before me, naked but for a pelt of coarse fur. Pointed ears twitched atop an almost wolf-like head. Ember eyes blazed with feral malice in a distorted face that was a grotesque melding of human and beast. The creature lunged impossibly fast. I felt the flashlight fly from my grip, saw it pinwheel off into the darkened bushes. Something hard and heavy slammed into my back. The coppery taste of blood slicked my tongue. A guttural, snarling voice sounded above me, the words bizarrely human. "Looks like meat's back on the menu, boys." Then the werewolf was on me in a whirlwind of snapping fangs and piercing claws, and the world dissolved into a red miasma of agony. I ran, crashing through the midnight underbrush as anguished howls reverberated through the forest at my back. Thorns ripped at my face, my clothing. I barely felt their sting, consumed as I was by the singular need to put distance between myself and the horrors that pursued me. My lungs seared, each gasping breath a serrated blade in my chest. The beam of my recovered flashlight bobbed crazily in front of me. I don't know how long or how far I ran through that inky wilderness, knowing only the hammering of my heart and the burn of my legs as I crashed through underbrush and vaulted fallen logs, the baying of the pack always at my back, never letting me rest. When I stumbled into a clearing and saw the derelict hut hunched in its center, I nearly wept with relief. Dilapidated and visibly abandoned, the log structure nonetheless represented shelter, a small modicum of safety in this endless nightmare. I lurched through the doorless entry on rubbery legs, collapsing against a wall with a sob. The interior was barren save for drifts of leaves blown in by years of neglect. Old newspapers scattered across the floor, faded and brittle. A cracked oil lantern sat on a rickety table coated in dust and cobwebs. My respite was short-lived. No sooner had I caught my breath than a chilling howl rolled through the night, far too close. They had found me, again. Panic launched me to my feet. I had to bar the door, fortify this pitiful shelter. But as I scanned the small room, my hope crumbled to ash. There was no door to barricade, no windows to shutter. I was a rat in a trap, waiting for the wolves to descend. My flashlight beam fell upon a trap door set into the floorboards, nearly invisible beneath the detritus. A root cellar, perhaps, a bolt hole. Barely daring to breathe, I hauled open the rotted wood, wincing as it released a screech of rusted hinges. I waited, certain the sound would bring the pack down upon me, but only silence reigned, the night holding its breath. After a long moment, I aimed my flashlight into the cellar below. A earthen chamber opened beneath the hut, deeper than I would have guessed, and something glinted in the darkness, catching the quavering beam. I lowered myself down, dreading what I might find, but knowing I had no recourse. The pack would be on me at any moment. As my feet touched damp earth, the flashlight illuminated a scene out of nightmare. Backpacks, shredded clothing, rusted camping gear, all riddled with horrible rents and tears. Dark stains splattered the dirt walls, the color of old blood. Bones littered the ground, far too many to be animal remains. Skulls peered up at me in the gloom, their empty sockets accusing. I stumbled back with a strangled cry. The werewolves' larder, trophies from their hunts, their kills. Bile seared my throat as I counted skulls. 5, 10 more. A glint of metal caught my eye. There, half buried in moldering cloth, a revolver pitted with rust but intact. Was this what had drawn my flashlight? I scooped up the gun, hands trembling as I checked the cylinder. 3 corroded rounds glinted within, the brass dull. Not much, but far better than fang and claw. How many victims had huddled here in terror, waiting for death? The same demise that awaited me if I didn't act. Grim resolution crystallized in my mind. I wouldn't go quietly into that good night. Wouldn't let the monsters take me. Not without a fight. I considered my odds. 3 silver bullets against an unknown number of werewolves. But what other choice did I have? To cower in this hole among the dead until the pack came for me? No. Better to face them head-on, to make my last stand beneath the pitiless stars. Jaw set, I climbed out of that tomb. On some level, I knew I was climbing toward my own death. But I would meet it on my feet, gripping the cold steel of the revolver. I almost hoped the werewolves heard the trapdoor's shriek as it slammed shut behind me. Let them come. Let them taste the silver I would feed them, round by blessed round. I stared out the empty doorway, down the yawning barrel of the gun, waiting for the deadlights of their eyes, waiting for the end. They came with the moonrise, shadows detaching from deeper shadow to flow into the clearing. My finger tightened on the trigger as luminous eyes pierced the gloom, drawing ever closer. I counted 3 pairs, then 5. Dear God, how many were there? The pack circled the hut in a lazy, predatory dance, low growls rumbling from barrel chests. Muscular bodies rippled beneath shaggy pelts, raw power married to feral grace. They were savoring the moment, drawing out the inevitable for their own cruel pleasure. I sighted down the revolver at the nearest beast, my hands remarkably steady. Patience. Let them draw closer until I couldn't possibly miss. The leader prowled nearer on twisted legs, its grotesque face caught in a shaft of moonlight. Not quite wolf, not quite man, but some blasphemous melding of the two. Lank hair hung about its shoulders in matted ropes, fangs gleamed between black lips, talons tipped brutish fingers that flexed with the need to rend and tear. "Come on, you bastards," I snarled through clenched teeth. "Come and get me." I squeezed the trigger. The report cracked across the clearing like a whip, impossibly loud. The lead werewolf stumbled mid-stride, a smoking hole appearing in its misshapen brow. It crumpled to the ground and lay still. The pack fell upon their fallen comrade in a frenzy of yipping barks and eerie howls. I used their distraction to line up another shot, the revolver bucking in my grip. A second beast jerked and tumbled, my last bullet finding its heart. Then the werewolves were charging the hut in a blur of fur and fang, enraged by the deaths of their own. I scrabbled backward, fumbling to reload with shaking hands. The first creature burst through the doorway, its skull scraping the low lintel. Lamplight gleamed in rabid eyes. Strings of drool dangled from a fanged maw that yawned impossibly wide. I brought the gun up, knowing I was too late. The werewolf lunged, a growl thundering from its throat. I felt its fetid breath, saw mayhem glinting in crazed eyes. I squeezed my own shut, a final prayer on my lips. Agony never came. A snarl, a meaty thud, a yelp. I cracked an eye to see the werewolf sprawled across the floor, its neck bent at an unnatural angle. A figure towered over the corpse, tall and whipcord lean. The stranger turned, her severe face thrown into sharp relief. It was the old Indian woman from the trading post. She held an odd curved knife in one bony hand, its blade black and oily. Her stony eyes met mine, dark with ancient knowledge. "Silver alone cannot stop the Wendigo," she said, her voice like gravel. "Only copper and ash can end their reign." More lupine shapes crowded the doorway, slavering jaws mere feet away. The crone brandished her blade with fluid grace, placing herself between me and certain death. "When I say run, run," she commanded, "and never look back." The werewolves attacked. She met them with flashing steel and an ululating war cry torn from another era. Talons and fangs sought her leathery flesh, but she danced between the beasts, her blade opening gouts of steaming blood wherever it kissed. "Run!" she screamed. I ran, bursting past the melee and out into the eldritch night. Howls of rage and pain dogged my heels as I plunged into the forest, my entire being focused on escape. Only later, huddled against a tree trunk as dawn turned the sky to ash, did I realize I still gripped the useless revolver, my knuckles white around its grip. The gunshot still echoed in my ears, warring with the old woman's final, fading scream. In the thin light I saw that my hands were sticky with gore not my own, the werewolf's blood. It seemed I had not escaped the monsters after all. I had become one. Gray dawn found me shivering and alone, watching the forest lighten by degrees through eyes that felt packed with ground glass. The night's horrors replayed themselves in the theater of my mind. The abandoned hut, the bones of the werewolves' victims, the feral light in lupine eyes as they bore down upon me, and her, the old woman, my unlikely savior, who had sacrificed herself so that I might survive. But had I? Truly? The revolver still hung heavy in my grip, a leaden weight. The werewolf's blood itched as it dried on my skin, the scent of it cloying. I had escaped the monsters by the narrowest of margins, but I knew, deep in my marrow, that a part of me would never leave this forest, that the evil that dwelled here had left its indelible mark upon my soul. The authorities would ask questions, I knew. What had become of my fellow ranger, who had ventured into these woods and never returned? What of the old woman's body, savaged by tooth and claw? The werewolf's larder of bones and shredded camping gear? I had no answers to give them, none they would believe at any rate. The creatures I had faced, the bloody showdown in the lonely dark, these were the stuff of late-night creature features, not the rational world of parks and rangers. I would be branded as a madman, or worse, a murderer. No one would ever find the hut. Of that I was certain. The forest would keep its secrets as it always had. Already the horrors of the night felt distant, hazy, like a half-remembered nightmare that evaporates upon waking. But I knew the truth. I had seen the face of evil and felt its fetid breath upon my skin. I had gazed into amber eyes that held no shred of humanity and heard the screams of the dying echo through timeless trees. The werewolves were still out there, waiting, hungry, ready to resume their savage hunt beneath the pitiless eye of the moon. And I would forever be the one that got away. The lone soul that staggered out of the forest alive but not unscathed, never that. I would bear the scars of this night for the rest of my days, and with every rising of the full moon I would remember the blood, the pursuit, the terrible animal screams. I rose on unsteady legs, the revolver falling from my numb fingers. It hardly mattered now. No amount of cold steel could undo the damage that had been wrought. The ranger station waited, manned by blessedly familiar faces and hot coffee. Reports to be filed, search parties to be mustered. They would have questions, so many questions. But no explanation I could give would ever capture the true horror of what had happened here. I turned my back on the forest and began to walk, each leaden step an agony. A bitter wind gusted, carrying the scents of pine and old death, and beneath it all, a long, eerie howl. The hunt was over. But it was not the end. Of that I had no doubt. The monsters would return. They always did. That was the nature of true evil. It might sleep, but it never died. A branch cracked in the undergrowth behind me, a footfall or something more sinister. I didn't look back. I couldn't. If I did, I knew I would see the werewolf's blazing eyes, hungry, watchful, waiting for the hunt to begin anew. The autumn air was crisp as I set off down the trailhead, my boots crunching the first fallen leaves of the season. Although I had hiked this route countless times during my years as a park ranger, today felt different. An unusual stillness hung over the forest, as if the birds and creatures were collectively holding their breath. I had taken a leave of absence after a difficult summer marked by too many inexplicable disappearances in the park's backcountry. The guilt of not finding those lost souls weighed heavily on me. I needed to clear my head with a solo trek before the long winter set in. The path meandered through stands of towering pines that swayed and creaked in the strengthening wind. Shafts of sunlight pierced the canopy, illuminating the colorful understory, but also casting long, disorienting shadows across the forest floor. Clouds scudded across the sky, their shapes morphing into disturbing forms when glimpsed through the latticework of branches. After a few miles, I reached a fork where the main trail split off towards a scenic overlook. But the intersection was marred by an official warning sign I had never seen before. The metal placard was scratched and weathered, as if it had been posted for years, but the message was still legible. Closed, dangerous conditions, enter at your own risk. Below that, someone had scrawled, "Beware the trickster," in reddish lettering that looked unsettlingly like dried blood. A prickle tickled the back of my neck, that uncanny sense of being watched by unseen eyes. I scanned the heavy brush but saw no one, just more shifting shadows. The wind whistled through the boughs, carrying an eerie keen that sounded almost human, almost. Unease coiled in my gut, but I pushed it down. I was being foolish, jumpy. My frayed nerves were just a product of stress and overwork. I was the only one out here. What was the worst that could happen? Resolving to stay on the main trail, I shouldered my pack and pressed deeper into the wilderness. By late afternoon, I came across the first signs that I was not as alone as I had hoped. The dusty track was crisscrossed with bizarre animal prints, the likes of which I had never encountered in my years of fieldwork. The four-toed marks were too large for a coyote, too small for a bear. And the gait was all wrong, the stride too long and loping. It almost looked like a cross between a man and a wolf. I crouched to study the anomalies, bafflement warring with rising unease. The tracks veered off into dense thickets on either side of the trail, as if something was pacing me just out of sight, mirroring my movements. I was debating whether to follow the prints or continue on when the crack of a snapped twig made me start. A figure emerged from the tree line on silent feet, a wiry old indigenous man with long gray hair and fathomless dark eyes that seemed to look right through me. He was dressed in well-worn hides, and his lined face bore the blue-green tattoos of the local tribe. "You should not be here," he said without preamble, his voice low and solemn. "These woods are not safe, not anymore, not for your kind." "I'm sorry, do I know you?" I asked, thoroughly confused. "I'm a ranger here. I assure you I know these lands quite well." The old native stared at me, inscrutable. "The one you seek is not what it appears. It wears many skins, but its heart is black as rot, and it knows you are here. You must turn back before it is too late." A nameless dread settled over me at his words. I opened my mouth to press him for more details, but the man spun and disappeared between the trees as suddenly as he had arrived, leaving me gaping. Heart pounding, I searched the undergrowth where he had vanished. The plants were undisturbed, not a leaf or twig out of place. It was as if he had never existed. But 30 paces ahead on the trail I spotted fresh tracks, too large to be human, too bipedal to be animal. And they were heading in the same direction I was walking, into the depths of the forest. As the shadows lengthened, a flicker of auburn caught my eye near a massive fir tree. At first I took it for a deer flashing its white tail in alarm, but as I focused on the spot, a sickening certainty washed over me. It wasn't a deer, it was a fox pelt, wrapped around the shoulders of a hulking, man-like figure that crept behind the trunk and out of sight. The glimpse lasted only a heartbeat, but it was enough. Blood turned to ice in my veins as every primal instinct screamed at me to flee. But it was too late. I was in its territory now, far from civilization, and night was falling. With each step, the trail became more faint, the trees pressing closer as if to swallow me whole. The topo map I had studied so carefully was suddenly useless. None of the landmarks matched what I was seeing. Mossy boulders and nurse logs I should have recognized were gone, replaced by unfamiliar terrain that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. I itched to consult my compass, but unease stayed my hand. Some primordial instinct warned that any sign of uncertainty would be like blood in the water, attracting unwanted attention. So I pressed forward, keeping my head high and purposeful even as true north slipped away. Twilight stained the sky as nightfall crept in on cat's paws. Nocturnal birds burst from cover with jarring cries that set my teeth on edge. A barred owl hooted 3 times. "Who cooks for you?" Its mournful call echoing like a taunt. Because out here, far from the relative safety of my ranger cabin, I was no longer the top of the food chain. Against my better judgment, I decided to make camp in a small clearing rather than blunder blindly through the night. I found a level spot sheltered by towering hemlocks and shrugged off my heavy pack with a groan, rolling my stiff shoulders. It was only when I bent to unzip the main compartment that I noticed the torn strap dangling at an odd angle. The frayed nylon ends looked like they had been chewed by animal teeth. With rising horror, I realized the bag had been opened, and my supplies ransacked. Beef jerky, protein bars, my emergency blanket, all missing. But the radio, first aid kit, extra batteries, those were untouched. It was as if something had deliberately taken only the food, leaving me weak and vulnerable. The forest seemed to darken at the edges of my vision as the terrifying implications sank in. I numbly gathered wood for a small fire, knowing the dwindling light was my last defense. That's when I noticed the shreds of fabric caught on a nearby briar, the unmistakable orange of a hiker's canvas coat. Other tatters fluttered from low-hanging branches like macabre confetti, a scrap of plaid flannel here, a torn bandana there. And knotted around a splintered trunk was a snapped nylon cord of the kind used to secure food bags from hungry bears. My stomach clenched as I remembered the missing person reports that had flooded the ranger station all summer. Cold cases that had never been solved, experienced outdoorsmen who had vanished without a trace. Now the scraps of their existence lay before me like a breadcrumb trail into oblivion. White-knuckling my hatchet, I circled the perimeter of the clearing, searching for tracks. At the far edge, I found the missing food bags, or what was left of them. Shredded and empty, they littered the forest floor as if something had split them open in a frenzy. But that wasn't the worst of it, for there, pressed into the soft loam, was a single massive print. Not animal, not human, but some unholy hybrid of the two, its splayed toes tipped with vicious claws. A sonorous howl shattered the night, paralyzing me in place, because while the eerie sound started low like a wolf's cry, it ended on a high, keening note, a wail of undiluted human anguish, and it was very, very close. Darkness pressed against me from all sides as I huddled by the meager fire. The golden circle of light held the unknown at bay, but I could feel unseen things testing the edges, my hackles rising each time the flames guttered. Beyond the reach of the fire, the night was alive with malevolent activity. A continual rustle of dead leaves betrayed something circling the perimeter, sometimes on 4 feet, sometimes on 2. Low huffs of breath punctuated the gloom, too heavy for any forest creature I knew. Every so often a twig would snap with calculated loudness, as if to remind me how easily it could reach me if it wished. But it was toying with me first. The cold certainty settled in my bones, along with a numb sort of terror. I clutched my hatchet in a white-knuckled grip, my eyes straining to pierce the veil of shadow just beyond the flickering light. Sweat beaded my brow despite the bitter chill. My heart felt lodged in my throat, choking off my breath. I prepared to settle in for a long night of tormented vigilance when the first whispers began. They started as indistinct murmurs hovering at the edge of perception, easy to dismiss as a trick of the wind. But soon they resolved into snatches of words, fragmented and sibilant, slithering into my ears. Ranger. Not safe. Too late. With a thrill of horror, I recognized the voices. They belonged to the lost hikers whose disappearances I had investigated all those months, the innocent campers I had failed to save. I could hear their pain, their desperation. They were trying to warn me. The whispers grew more insistent, hissing from the darkness. Mustering my courage, I called out to them, begging for more information. But the voices instantly fell silent, replaced by a low, gruesome chuckle that skittered up my spine. It knew I was at its mercy. In a burst of panicked bravado, I snatched up a burning branch and thrust it towards the sound. The expanded sphere of orange light illuminated a pair of feral eyes glowing in the undergrowth. They bored into me with a savage intelligence full of cruel amusement. Then, between one blink and the next, they vanished. Unnerved, I spun in a tight circle, trying to cover my back. But in my haste, I stumbled over a gnarled root and fell hard, the branch flying from my hand. The flames sputtered out, plunging me back into disorienting blackness. In that moment, I felt a hot gust of carrion breath on my face, and a growl so low it vibrated in my bones. Fetid saliva dripped onto my nose, my cheek. Inch-long teeth snapped shut a hair's breadth from my throat. "Found you, Ranger," it spoke, and with those mocking words I knew the true depths of my predicament. This was no mere animal that had slipped its habitat. It was something far more ancient, more profoundly unnatural, and it had marked me as its prey. I crashed through the tangled brush in a blind panic, thorns raking my face and snagging my clothes. I had abandoned my pack and fled the clearing the instant the creature withdrew to regroup. I no longer cared about salvaging supplies or gear. Now my only concern was escape. The terrain had turned against me in an impossible way. Each tree I slalomed was a grasping claw, each vine a shackle about my ankle. The gnarled roots seemed to deliberately knot themselves to trip me up. Even the patterns of the stars had distorted, the familiar constellations scattered as if by a careless hand. In the distance, an unholy baying shattered the night. It was no single beast, but a whole diabolical menagerie giving tongue. The eerie choir spoke of pursuit, of implacable hunger, and beneath the cacophony pulsed an insidious note of dark satisfaction, the relish of a predator toying with its prey. I risked a glance behind me and instantly regretted it. In the moonlight filtering through the trees, I glimpsed a succession of obscene silhouettes bounding from trunk to trunk. One moment it was a skeletal deer with a boneless half-canine muzzle. The next, a flayed bear that loped on elongated limbs. Now a twisted amalgamation of owl and mountain lion, feathers melding into tawny fur. The shapes changed with a gut-churning fluidity, cycling through a whole host of chimeric horrors. But always those malevolent, ember-bright eyes tracked my every stumbling step. I was gasping like a bellows, my lungs searing and heart slamming against my ribs. But the baying only drew closer, spurring me to a manic breakneck pace. Sweat streamed into my eyes, half blinding me. My joints screamed in protest, but I rallied, knowing to slow was to die. Desperation pulled me up short at the rotted husk of a massive oak. Its trunk was wide enough to momentarily break line of sight. I threw myself behind it, trying to control my ragged breathing. With luck, I could wait until the thing overshot my position, then double back the way I had come. Hunched in on myself, I listened past the hammering pulse in my ears. Silence. Deafening, unnatural silence. The kind of quiet that only falls after an unspeakable violence. For a bizarre moment, I wondered if I had hallucinated the whole encounter, if the long months of stress and guilt had finally untethered my mind. Then I looked down. There, caught on a splinter and fluttering like an obscene pennant, was a scrap of bloodied hide. Tufts of coarse auburn fur still clung to it in places. It was shockingly cold to the touch and slimy, as if freshly peeled from the steaming carcass. The iron tang of blood filled my nostrils, making me gag. This was no phantasm of an overstrained psyche. The monster was terribly, viscerally real, and now it had physical evidence of my presence, an unambiguous sign of my intrusion into its territory. There would be no escape, no reprieve. The hunt was on, and I was the quarry. After what felt like an eternity of desperate flight, I broke from the tree line into a small, overgrown clearing. At its center hunched a ramshackle cabin, its hewn logs grayed with age and choked with moss. The roof sagged under the weight of fallen branches, and the windows were lightless sockets peering blindly into the night. It was a far cry from the tidy ranger shelters I was used to, but it represented sanctuary, a threshold the creature might hesitate to cross. Sucking in a shaking breath, I stumbled towards the door, my exhausted muscles screaming with each step. The hinges shrieked as I shouldered my way inside, making me flinch. But the adrenaline singing through my veins quickly turned to ice as I registered the state of the cabin's interior. It had been ransacked with malicious abandon. Ancient furniture lay in kindling-sized shards, the splinters black with old blood. Shredded bits of cloth and tufts of unidentifiable fur drifted in the faint draft from the door. And there, heaped in the center of the floor like grotesque party streamers, were the personal effects of the creature's previous victims. I recognized the shredded remains of a child's teddy bear, its button eyes torn out. A woman's locket gleamed dully, its delicate chain snapped, and everywhere, strewn like macabre confetti, were jagged shards of bone too small to identify. My heart seized as I recalled the missing children, the couples who had never returned from their anniversary hikes, all those innocent lives cut brutally short. But it was the walls that drew my eye and held it with sickened fascination. They were papered over with yellowed news clippings, the headlines screaming of unsolved disappearances dating back decades. Excerpts from ancient texts on Native American folklore and mythology had been pinned up beside them, connected by a mad scrawl of red string. With mounting horror, I scanned the faded articles, piecing together the terrible truth. The creature that hunted me was a skinwalker of legend, an evil shaman who had achieved the ultimate taboo, the ability to take the form of any beast. Once human, it had traded its soul for a taste of power, transforming into something wholly unnatural. And now it stalked the wildlands in search of prey, driven by an insatiable hunger for violence. Worse, the clippings alleged that skinwalkers could read minds, that they delighted in assuming the shape of their victims' loved ones before moving in for the kill. For a split second, an image of my fiancée flickered behind my eyes before I could banish it. A new dread settled cold and leaden in my gut. I had to keep moving to find a weapon. I cast about desperately, my gaze alighting on the splintered remains of a heavy oak table. Seizing one of the legs, I hefted it experimentally. The solid weight was reassuring in my hands, something to bludgeon with. Thus armed, I crept towards the back of the cabin, seeking a rear exit. But before I could take more than a step, a floorboard creaked behind me with deliberate slowness. I spun, table leg raised, to see a figure silhouetted in the doorway, one with achingly familiar curves haloed by the amber glow of the rising sun. "Oh God, baby, is that you?" My fiancée's voice quavered, clogged with tears. "I've been looking everywhere for you." She took a step forward, arms outstretched. I stared at her, uncomprehending. This was impossible. She was hundreds of miles away, safe at home. The cold certainty crashed over me then, as I remembered the final clipping. Skinwalkers often took the form of beautiful women to lure their victims to their doom. "You're not her," I said hoarsely, willing my voice not to tremble. "Baby, you're scaring me," my fiancée replied, her green eyes wide and pleading. "I drove all night to get here. The rangers at the station told me you were missing, that people have been disappearing in these woods. I had to find you before. She dissolved into racking sobs, pressing her hands to her face. It was a perfect imitation, from the lilt of her speech to her hiccuping little breaths. So close to the real thing, but I knew the truth now. "Enough!" I roared, brandishing the table leg like a club. It was a warning gesture, a confirmation that I had seen through the illusion. "Show yourself, you filthy beast." "No." My fiancé, no, the thing that wore her face, wailed. It staggered towards me, arms outstretched beseechingly. "It's me. Don't you recognize me? We're going to get married, remember? You're supposed to love me." But my death grip on the makeshift weapon didn't waver. I backed away, edging along the rear wall of the cabin, seeking an escape route. The thing continued to advance, still openly weeping, but I saw the undercurrent of rage in its eyes now, the feral gleam of thwarted hunger. It hadn't expected me to see through its ruse. "Please," it whimpered, changing tack. "I'm so scared. Hold me? Let's get out of here together, go somewhere safe." I pivoted, ramming my shoulder into the back door with all my strength. The rotted wood buckled, and I stumbled into the gray pre-dawn. The thing lunged after me with a roar, its anguished sobs turning to a furious howl. I felt its breath hot on my neck as I ran blindly into the woods. I made it maybe 100 yards before it caught me. A crushing weight slammed into my back, hurling me to the forest floor. Pine needles filled my nose and mouth as I struggled to turn over, to face my attacker. My fingers scrabbled in the dirt for a weapon, a rock, anything. "You wanted to see?" The thing hissed from its perch on my chest. I stared up in abject horror as my fiancé's lovely features melted like wax, running together obscenely. Gobbets of flesh sloughed away to reveal glistening sinew and jutting bone beneath. The eyes were the last human feature to go, bleeding from emerald green to sickly yellow, the pupils slitted like a snake's. In its place hulked a nightmare made real, a twisted mass of fangs and fur and watchful, glittering eyes. Parts of it were still recognizable, here a glistening black bear's haunch, there the speckled flank of a deer, but they were melded together by pulsing ropes of gristle in a way that was profoundly, viscerally wrong. "Do you see now, Ranger?" The words shifted from the warped remnants of a human mouth to a jackal's muzzle and back again as it spoke. "All this meat, all the skins I've taken, and I'm still so hungry. You've kept me waiting so long." Its voice was a physical thing, skittering over my skin like 1,000 crawling ants. I gagged on the rancid stench of its breath, the spoor of rot and old blood. The creature's baleful eyes glowed like hot coals as it lowered its dripping maw towards my face. I scrabbled frantically beneath me, my fingers closing around a fist-sized rock. With a cry, I brought it crashing against the thing's temple with all my remaining strength. The creature reeled back with an enraged shriek, its misshapen head snapping to the side. Black ichor spurted from the wound, sizzling where it splashed on the leaves. Seizing my chance, I heaved myself free and pelted towards the lightning east, chased by the sound of splintering trees and maddened roars. I ran as I had never run before, expecting at any moment to feel the Skinwalker's fetid breath on my neck, its cruel jaws closing around my throat. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out all other sound. The forest blurred past me in a smear of shadow and sickly gray light. But as the first crimson rays of dawn pierced the canopy, I heard the creature let out a strangled howl. It was a sound of rage and frustration, but also of pain. I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw the thing writhing on the ground, steam rising from its misshapen body where the sunlight touched it. Of course, like all evil things, it could not abide the light. I stumbled onward, fueled by hope now as much as terror. If I could just make it to the trailhead, to the safe normalcy of the ranger station, I would be beyond its reach. At last, after what felt like hours, I broke from the tree line onto the packed dirt of the main trail. I nearly wept with relief at the sight of those familiar boot-worn tracks. But my elation was short-lived. For there, smeared in the dust as if in warning, was a single massive print. Not animal, not human, but some twisted parody of the two, and it was fresh. I whirled, scanning the forest's edge, my breath coming in sharp pants. The shadows seemed to writhe and beckon, concealing 1,000 watching eyes. From the depths of the woods rose the discordant cry of a loon, a sound like mocking laughter. The knowledge crashed over me then, cold and certain. It had toyed with me, let me think I had escaped, but it would be back. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but someday when I least expected it, I would see that flash of auburn at the corner of my eye, feel that hot carrion breath on my neck. It had marked me, and it would never let me go. Not really. A piece of it would always be with me, waiting to strike, biding its time until it could finish the hunt. With a shudder, I turned my back on the predatory forest and limped toward civilization, towards the promise of sunlight and safety. But even as the ranger station came into view, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, stalked, hunted. No matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, I knew I would never truly escape the hungry eyes in the dark. The Skinwalker would be out there, waiting in the space between nightmares and waking. And someday, it would find me again. The forest closed in around me as I hiked the lonely trail, my boots crunching on the gravel path. Sunlight filtered through the trees, but even at midday the woods felt dark and primeval. An unnatural hush lay over everything, broken only by the eerie calls of crows. I was a seasoned backcountry ranger, used to trekking solo through remote wilderness for days on end to monitor trails and campsites. But today felt different somehow, heavy with a sense of foreboding. The air itself seemed thick and watchful, as if the forest was sizing me up, waiting. I brushed aside my unease, chalking it up to too many nights reading eerie tales around the campfire. The miles slid by under my steady pace, and I reveled in the solitude, my senses singing with the mingled scents of pine and leaf mold. But slowly I became aware of a trickling unease. The back of my neck prickled, the fine hairs standing up. I had the uncanny sensation of being observed by unseen eyes. Glancing around, I saw nothing but serried ranks of trees marching up the hillsides. No hint of movement. But still the feeling persisted. As evening drew on, my disquiet increased. The normal chatter and rustle of wildlife seemed muted, the bird songs strangely discordant. Even the wind felt wrong somehow as it sighed through the branches, carrying an elusive taint, a whiff of something feral. I made camp in a hollow ringed by sentinel firs, but sleep was slow to come. Something was out there in the night. I could feel it. Dawn revealed a world wreathed in mist. Dew silvered every surface, refracting the pale light into a shifting kaleidoscope of grays. I emerged from my tent, stretching the kinks from my spine, and bent to rekindle last night's fire. That's when I saw the tracks. They meandered through my campsite, weaving between tent and tree line. Bipedal but oddly misshapen, the prints were like nothing I'd ever seen before. Not human, but not quite animal either. I crouched to examine them. Each print was nearly 18 inches long and half as wide, with a deep central pad and the impressions of 4 thick, splayed toes tipped in jagged claws. A chill stole through me. No creature that I knew of left tracks like these. As I followed the trail with my eyes, I realized it encircled my campsite completely. Round and round, as if something had paced a ring around me all through the long reaches of the night, watching me sleep. My breath gusted out in a shaky sigh. Rattled, I broke camp with haste, dousing my fire and packing my gear with extra speed. The strange prints meandered off into the trees, and I turned my feet in the opposite direction. As I hiked, an urgent mantra pounded in my head. Get out, get out, get out. A few miles on, I crossed paths with an old trapper, a leathery, weathered man trailing a brace of coonhounds. His eyes were flinty as agates. When I mentioned the tracks, he spat and made a sign against evil. "You'll steer clear if you know what's good for ye," he rasped. "There's things in these hills best left alone." Before I could press him further, he hurried on his way with a last uneasy backward glance. The day waxed toward noon. I rested in a sunlit glade, trying to shake my unsteadiness, when a glint of color snagged my eye. There, caught on a briar at the edge of the clearing, fluttered a scrap of red fabric, faded and tattered as if torn from a shirt or jacket. My unease surged. This was no well-traveled trail. What poor lost soul had passed this way before me? I didn't linger to ponder, just hurried on, a new note of fear thrilling in my veins. The afternoon wore on, shadows lengthened, edges blurring into gloom beneath the trees. I should have covered twice the distance I had, but the trail played tricks, seeming to twist and loop back on itself. The harder I tried to get my bearings, the more muddled they became. A creeping dread took root in my gut. I felt I was being herded, maneuvered like a rat in a maze by some unseen force. As dusk closed in, I had no choice but to make camp again. All through that long, dark night, I huddled by my feeble fire, shotgun across my knees, jumping at every snapping twig, every rustle of leaf. But I saw nothing. No tracks disturbed the dirt come morning. Just that same uncanny watchfulness, the sense of eyes upon me, patient and curious and full of hunger. On the third day, I woke haggard and hollow-eyed, dragging like my bones were made of lead. A dense fog crept along the ground, wreathing everything in ghostly tendrils. I forced down some cold rations, my appetite gone. The fog burned off as I hiked, but disorientation still dogged me. The sun wheeled haphazard in the sky, shadows stretching at crazy angles. At times the trees seemed to ripple and change when I wasn't looking directly at them, like reflections in a funhouse mirror. I laughed, but the sound emerged cracked and jittery. By afternoon I was thoroughly lost, my map and compass useless. The sense of being stalked, circled, only intensified. Sounds began to filter through the trees, almost subliminal at first. A scraping, shuffling tread just at the edge of hearing. Low whines and yips, sounding almost human, but jarringly off, like an animal imitating human cries. I whirled around over and over, trying to pinpoint the source, but the noises always stayed maddeningly out of reach. Dusk seemed to fall too soon, the sky shading rapidly to indigo shot with bloody streaks of red. My breath came short and sharp. I made camp on a piney ridge but found little comfort. Peculiar debris littered the site. A tube of lipstick, a single hiking boot splashed with some dark stain, the splintered remains of a camera. That night I didn't even pretend to sleep. I just fed the fire with shaking hands and stared wide-eyed into the treacherous dark. True night fell like a shroud over the forest. The spindly arms of trees clawed at the sky, blotting out the stars until only fragmented glimpses remained, cold and glittering and impossibly distant, as if the world had fallen away, leaving me suspended in some endless, eternal void. The night seemed to draw in close, smothering, full of dreadful promise. An awful hush blanketed everything, the kind of silence that feels like a held breath, poised on the knife's edge of a scream. Even the whisper of my own pulse felt too loud, an obscene interruption of that watchful quiet. Then it began. The noises, drifting through that unnatural stillness, a rustling, circling all around the edges of my little firelit circle, snuffling grunts, the soft snap of a twig. For a terrified instant I was certain I glimpsed a shape, tall and distorted, weaving between the trees. But when I focused on it, it was gone, melting into shadow. With mounting horror I noticed strange depressions in the pine needle duff around my campsite, as if something heavy had settled there, watching me. My supplies lay strewn and rifled through, wrappers shredded by teeth or claws. And then, drifting from the darkness, a voice, a perfect imitation of a human voice but grotesque, the inflection all wrong. It called my name, the syllables stretched out in a sort of mocking sing-song. "Ranger," it hissed, "come out and play." Absolute mind-blanking terror turned my limbs to jelly. I cringed against a tree bole, shotgun clutched white-knuckled in my shaking grip. Every instinct screamed to run, to flee headlong into the night, but I knew with grim certainty that that was exactly what it wanted. So I sat there, rigid and quaking, all through that black eternity of night, while the voice whispered obscene promises from the darkness and mad laughter shivered on the wind. False dawn limned the horizon in a deathly gray pallor. The whispering voices faded with the night, but a dull dread sat like a stone in my belly. I knew I couldn't stay here. Something was out there in the woods, something that had marked me, desired me. My only chance was to run, to try to break free of this eldritch forest before madness took me. I abandoned all my gear save a handful of essentials. anything to lighten my load, hasten my flight. Then I ran, a stumbling, graceless lope, sheer animal panic lending me speed. The bizarrely elongated shadows writhed across the path before me. My heart battered itself against my ribs. My head pounded with a high, thin whine of terror. Behind me I could hear it, crashing through the bracken, not even trying for stealth anymore. The heavy thud of footfalls, the shuss of branches thrust aside. A rank animal musk flooded my nostrils. I dared one glance over my shoulder and glimpsed a nightmare mashup of forms, wolf and bear and stag, all fused together and horribly, hideously wrong. A slather of foam flew from its misshapen jaws. I ran until my lungs were bursting, until the forest blurred into a smear of greens and browns, and my pulse roared in my ears. But always it was there behind me, untiring, implacable. A flicker of movement to my left made me whip my head around. I barely processed the impression of a naked human form, grotesquely elongated, before it vanished between the trees. Dear God, there were more than one. The chase seemed to go on for hours. The thing would let me gain some distance, let me think I'd lost it, before crashing out of the undergrowth right on my heels once more. It was toying with me, I realized, with a surge of hopeless rage. This was all a game to it. The air burned like acid in my lungs. My pulse throbbed behind my eyeballs. And still I ran, a wounded animal lurching on instinct alone, awaiting the fatal strike. But it never came. Whatever these things were, they wanted me alive. The knowledge brought no comfort. At last, near delirious with exhaustion, I burst out of a cut-leaf tangle of thorns, bloody and clawed, to find myself in a clearing dominated by a decaying cabin. Weeping with relief, I sprinted those last few yards to the sagging porch and flung myself through the door, slamming the tottering slab of oak behind me. It wasn't much, but it was shelter, an eye in this storm of terror. I collapsed on the dusty floor, drawing huge, shuddering breaths. Outside, the night woke again in shrieks and howls. Clawed hands scrabbled at the walls, the door. Gleeful chitters and groans echoed from the darkness. They had me cornered now, a rat in a trap. With wooden fingers, I flipped the breech of my shotgun, feeding in 2 red shells. Then I sat with my back to the wall, gun laid across my knees, and waited. The hut was barely more than a single room, thick with cobwebs and the musty stink of rotted wood. Rusty implements hung from hooks on the walls, a coil of wire, an antique kerosene lantern dark with crusted oil, a carpenter's saw brown with old blood. What in God's name had happened here? Water-stained cardboard boxes mounded in the corners, spilling ragged clothes and mouse-chewed papers. It looked like someone had been staying here, camping out maybe. How long ago? Gingerly, I pushed aside a moult of moth-eaten plaid and fished out a tattered leather satchel. Inside was a brace of old love letters, girlishly looping handwriting spidered across yellowing pages, and a journal filled with an unhinged scrawl veering into incomprehensibility. Fragments leapt out at me in the guttering lantern light. They come at night, whispering my name. They know me, know my most secret heart. Caught a glimpse today. Impossible angles. The human form is just a shell they put on and take off. An intelligence older than mankind looks out from behind their eyes. Cold, inhuman, they are the forest. Gooseflesh prickled along my arms. Whatever stalked these woods, I wasn't the first it had tormented. Cold certainty settled in my gut. I would not be the last. Finally, tucked in the journal's back pocket, a sheaf of faded newspaper clippings. Search continues for missing hikers. Authorities baffled by strange disappearances in National Park. Native legends tell of creatures that walk like men. The words blurred and ran together as my hands shook. Dear God, how long had these things hunted here, preying on the lost, the unwary? I thought of that old tracker's words, his warding gesture against evil. The locals knew, they'd always known. But no one was coming for me. No last-minute rescue, no salvation. I was alone in this godforsaken hut, and outside the dog things prowled and slavered for my blood. I checked the loads in my shotgun again. 2 shells. That was all that stood between me and those nightmare jaws. All through that long night they huffed and growled outside the walls, clicking their teeth, giggling with insane glee. They screamed my name in the voices of loved ones, mimicking a child's terrified sobbing. I huddled in my corner, hands clasped over my ears, the gun trembling in my grip, praying for a dawn that crept with aching slowness over the horizon. The next evening I crouched by a grease-spotted window, stomach hollow, head pounding, peering into the purple twilight. Shadows flowed between the trees, taking on awful forms at the corner of my vision, only to dissolve into darkness again when I tried to fix them with my gaze. They were out there, watching, waiting with that terrible, eternal patience. A grating scrape made me whip around, gun surging up to track on. Nothing, just the window frame on the opposite wall. Except I froze. The window gaped open, a jagged black mouth. Clawed gouges marred the sill, splinters pale against dark rotting wood. Sweet Jesus. It had worked the window open, heaved its grotesque bulk through that narrow gap while my back was turned. It was inside with me. The shadows flexed, gathered, vomited forth a shape. My mind struggled to process the sheer wrongness before me, a grinning wolf mask of a face topping a lumpy, misshapen body that seemed to flow like heated wax. Then it unfurled and rose to its full, impossible height, all sinewy limbs and merging, splitting mouths that laughed and laughed and laughed. "You let me in, Ranger," it said, a gloating, triumphant purr. "You know the lore. You have to invite us, yes, and you did. You brought me right in." Ice water trickled down my spine. Some distant part of my brain screamed that I should shoot, squeeze that trigger, unload both barrels into the thing's filthy heart. But my limbs had turned to stone. I could only gape in mute, transfixed horror. It minced closer, shifting, changing, cycling through forms. Now a gaunt, deer-headed thing with cloven hooves, now a spindly, child-sized figure with mournful, glassy doll's eyes. With dawning nausea, I saw that it wore the clothes from the boxes, a moldering army jacket, a grease-slick ball cap, a thin floral print dress, trophies from its former victims. "What's the matter, boy? Don't you recognize your old dad?" It hissed in my father's voice. I choked on a sob. It knew, dear God, it knew. It had pulled that secret longing, that unhealed wound from the depths of my mind. "We can be anyone you want, sweetling," it sing-songed, a slender arm elongated, a writhing spear aimed for my heart. "We can love you, make all the bad things go away." Every fiber of my being cried out to surrender to that crooning voice, to fall into that fatal embrace and let blessed madness take me. But deep in my hindbrain, some last spark of defiance flared to life. "No," I croaked, "you're not him. You're not any of them." I flung myself sideways as that spear-point arm lanced down. Fetid breath gusted hot against my cheek. Talons snagged in my shirt, shredding fabric, scoring skin. I crashed into the table, scrabbling for the gun. Clawed hands seized my shoulders, yanking me back. I twisted, bringing the shotgun up one-handed. The blast was thunderous in that confined space. The creature reeled back, a fist-sized hole blown in its chest. Black ichor splattered the walls, but still it came on, shark-toothed jaws gaping, hands hooked into claws. I fired again. Click, click. Fuck the shells, I'd forgotten. It lunged. I met it head-on, skull to skull. We crashed to the floor in a writhing tangle of thrashing limbs. Needle teeth snapped for my face. I bashed at it with the gun butt again and again, until the wood splintered and my hands ran slick with blood. At last it shuddered and lay still, a boneless sack of skin and reeking fur. I wrenched free of its slackening grip and crouched panting over the body. It twitched, shivered. Before my disbelieving eyes, cold mud sucked the carcass down, down into the earth, until nothing remained but a dark stain. A howl of purest fury split the night outside, rising and ebbing. I could picture them out there, shadows boiling in a frenzy. I'd killed one of their own, goaded them past all caution or restraint. When they came again, and they would come, it would be a red reckoning. I had to move now. I lunged for the door, nearly pitching headlong down the rotting steps. Then I was running, plunging heedless into the woods. Branches whipped my face, stones turned beneath my feet, pitching me sprawling. Behind me rose a swelling yammering, the buck and snap of powerful jaws. They were coming, and this time there would be no mercy. Time lost all meaning. I pelted through an endless nightmare of tangled thorns and clutching shadows, my pulse a war drum in my ears, my breath sobbing in my throat. The forest blurred into a smear of black. They were right behind me, toying with me. A cackling howl would shiver from the treetops, then cut off abruptly, leaving me whirling in circles. Baleful green eyes stared from the darkness, vanishing when I drew a bead on them. They could have taken me a dozen times over, dragged me down and shredded me with those black claws, but they wanted to draw this out, savor my terror. At last I burst from the tree line onto the verge of a cliff, skidding on the loose gravel. Far below, an angry gray river frothed over jutting boulders. Trapped. I spun to face my pursuers, my back to that drop. They came flowing from the woods, more shapes than I could count, merging and splitting in a seething mass. Hulking bear things, spindly stickmen with glowing eyes, writhing tentacled obscenities. Their voices lifted in an atonal choir, a maddening gibber that clawed at the tattered edges of my sanity. Nowhere left to run, meat, they crooned as one. Now you join the dance, now you belong to us. I backed up until my heels hung over empty space. Wind tugged at my hair. I looked down at the gun, the splintered ruin of the stock, the fouled, useless breech. Nothing more than a club now, but if I was going to die, I would die fighting. A strange calm descended over me then. I thought of the little I knew of the local tribes, their tales of spirit journeys and vision quests, of men who walked into the wilderness to pit themselves against the hungry ghosts that dwelled in its secret heart. Maybe that's all this had ever been, my trial, my test. I raised the gun like a war club, my lips peeling back from my teeth. Come on then, you bastards, let's dance. They surged forward as one, a breaking wave of chitin and teeth and grasping claws. I screamed my defiance, lashing out with the gun butt. Bones crunched, black blood sprayed. I felt iron jaws close on my calf, a white-hot flare of agony. Then the mass of them bore me backwards over the edge. I seemed to hang suspended for an eternity, dust motes swirling in the dawn light, the baying of the pack dopplering away beneath me. Then I smashed down into the icy emerald embrace of the river, and the world went away for a while. I came back to myself on the grassy bank miles downstream, coughing up water, my lungs on fire. Everything hurt. My left leg was a mass of blood, the flesh shredded down to the bone. But I was alive. Impossibly, insanely, I had survived. In a daze, I limped off downriver, following the first faint light of a new day. It felt like waking from a fever dream, the events of the last few nights already taking on the unreal sheen of delirium. But I knew better. Those haunted woods and the dark things that ran beneath the moon were seared into my brain. I would never be free of them, not really. They'd marked me, changed me on some intrinsic level. After a short eternity, I stumbled out onto a gravel Forest Service road. In the distance, I heard the low rumble of an engine. A truck rolled into view and drew up short, brakes squealing. A ranger in a green uniform leaned out the window, face gone slack with shock. I must have looked a fright, clothes hanging in tatters, body a mass of blood and bruises. I opened my mouth, but no words came. What was there to say? I spent 2 weeks in the hospital. The doctors marveled at my resilience, clucked over the mangled wreck of my leg. I told them a bear got me, a rogue attack deep in the backcountry. They nodded, but I could see the questions in their eyes. I spun a good story, though, and stuck to it. No point trying to convince them of the truth. Eventually, inevitably, I went back. To those deep woods, that haunted land of mist and shadow. I walk with a limp now, and the nights are full of darksome dreams. Sometimes I think I hear that mocking laughter shivering on the wind, sense those watchful eyes tracking me from the tree line. But I keep walking, keep searching. You see, I know the secret now. Those things in the forest, they're everywhere. They've always been here, wearing our skins, watching with our eyes, waiting in the cracks at the edge of the firelight. And I won't rest until I find a way to stop them, to end this dance once and for all, even if it takes me the rest of my life, even if it drives me mad. I'll keep walking into the darkness until I run out of road. The sun hung low on the horizon as I pulled up to the empty ranger station, deep in the remote wilderness of Algonquin Park. I stepped out of my pickup truck, boots crunching on the gravel, and breathed in the crisp autumn air, tinged with the scent of pine. As a park ranger, I was used to long stretches of solitude, safeguarding this pristine forest. But today felt different. An unusual stillness hung over the woods, the usual chatter of birds and rustle of leaves conspicuously absent. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something about the atmosphere unsettled me. I hefted my backpack from the truck bed and double-checked my supplies: trail rations, water purifier, first aid kit, radio, and bear spray. Everything seemed in order for my week-long patrol hike deep into the backcountry. Yet a prickle ran down my spine as I scanned the tree line. For a moment I thought I saw a shadow flit between the trunks, but when I blinked, it vanished. Must have been a trick of the fading light. Locking the station door behind me, I set off down the winding trail that would take me into the heart of the forest. The light filtering through the canopy grew steadily dimmer as the trees thickened around me. After an hour of steady hiking, an odd sensation crept over me, raising the hair on the back of my neck. It felt like I was being watched. I whirled around, scanning the underbrush, but saw nothing out of place. The woods had gone eerily quiet, not even a squirrel's chitter breaking the silence. I quickened my pace, unease rising in my gut. It was going to be a long week out here, alone in the wilderness. As the shadows lengthened and gloom gathered beneath the pines, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone in this remote corner of the park. Something was out there in the darkness, watching and waiting. I could only hope that whatever haunted these woods would pass me by. Dawn broke cold and gray, mist curling between the tree trunks as I broke camp and continued my patrol deeper into the forest. The strange sense of being watched had faded overnight, and I chided myself for letting my imagination get the better of me. Then I saw the tracks. At first I thought they were bear prints, but as I knelt for a closer look, icy fingers walked down my spine. The prints were canine in shape, but far too large for any wolf or coyote, and they seemed deformed somehow, the toes elongated like human fingers. I followed the tracks for a ways off the trail until they vanished into a tangle of devil's club and brambles. It made no sense. What kind of creature could leave tracks like that? Part of me wanted to investigate further, but the uneasy prickle on the back of my neck compelled me to continue on my patrol route. A few miles later, I was surprised to encounter another person out here in the deep backcountry, a grizzled local man in his 60s, rifle slung over his shoulder as he checked his trap line. He nodded to me warily. "Ranger," he grunted, "what brings you out this far? Been strange things in these woods of late?" "What kind of strange things?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level. The old-timer's eyes darkened. "Tracks that make no sense, shapes glimpsed in the mist, and sounds that ain't natural." He spat on the ground. "Something's haunting this forest, and mark my words, it ain't like no creature I ever seen. Best you watch yourself, Ranger, and don't go into the woods alone after sundown." With those ominous words, the trapper continued on his way, soon vanishing into the misty forest. I was left unsettled, my earlier unease surging back. I scanned the trees warily as I hiked. Was it just my imagination, or did the shadows seem to flicker and dance at the edges of my vision? I froze in my tracks as a chilling sound cut through the air, a long, mournful howl that sounded almost human. It echoed through the pines, then fell abruptly silent. The skin crawled on the back of my neck. There in the gloom between two massive hemlocks, I glimpsed a dark shape moving, far too tall to be any normal forest creature. As I fumbled for my bear spray with shaking hands, it vanished into the shadows like mist. Dear God, what was that thing? A chill ran through me, despite my layers of wool and fleece. My earlier unease hardened into real fear. The old trapper was right. Something unnatural stalked these woods. And out here, miles from civilization, I was utterly alone against it. With a rising sense of dread, I realized I had lost the trail. The gathering darkness of twilight made the towering pines loom menacingly overhead, distorting my sense of direction. I could have sworn the trail was to the east, but now I wasn't so sure. As I stood there, indecisive, a series of eerie yowls sounded from the underbrush to my left, guttural and savage, yet disturbingly human-like. Was it a trick of the acoustics in this valley, or the cries of some tormented animal? I wasn't about to investigate. I tried to get my bearings, seeking clearings in the trees to glimpse the setting sun, but it was futile. The forest canopy was too thick, turning the woods into a lightless maze of shadows. To make matters worse, a bone-chilling mist began to rise, snaking between the tree trunks and obscuring the ground. Unease turned to alarm as my eyes fell on a scrap of torn, blood-stained fabric caught on a branch, the remains of another hiker's jacket. Beside it, gouged into the trunk, were 4 deep claw marks far too large for any bear or mountain lion. Oh God, something terrible had happened here, and that something might still be out there, watching me even now. I couldn't escape the sense of malevolent eyes upon me, hidden in the murk. Swallowing my rising panic, I resolved to make camp for the night. To keep hiking in the darkness would be suicidal. I found a small hollow shielded by granite boulders and hastily pitched my one-man tent, starting a meager fire with trembling hands. All the while, I couldn't shake the awful certainty that I was not alone out here, that some unseen predator tracked my every move, waiting for its moment to strike. I gripped my bear spray tightly as I huddled by the dying embers, praying for dawn. It was going to be a long, terrifying night. Despite my exhaustion, sleep eluded me. The night closed in, impenetrable and suffocating, as the fire dwindled to faintly glowing coals. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig jolted me fully alert, my heart pounding against my ribs. Then the whispers began, sibilant, inhuman murmurs that seemed to come from all around the clearing. The words weren't English or any other language I recognized, yet they conveyed an awful malice that chilled me to my core. Something was out there in the darkness, circling, taunting me. Shadows danced at the edges of my feeble firelight, twisted, prowling shapes that vanished whenever I looked at them directly. Were they just trees distorted by my growing paranoia? Or was that horrible thing closing in for the kill? With numb horror, I realized that my backpack had been dragged several feet from where I'd left it, the contents strewn across the forest floor. Oh God, that thing had been right next to me as I'd fitfully dozed. Mouth dry with terror, I forced myself to gather my scattered supplies, never turning my back on the tree line. Then, at the edge of the dying firelight, I heard it, a guttural, rasping breath, like something from the depths of hell. A dark silhouette emerged from the mist, enormous and deformed, walking on 2 legs. Milky eyes glinted in the shadows of a face that was both canine and grotesquely human. It spoke, in a voice that chilled my blood, a perversion of human speech. "Run, grr." I ran then, blindly, heedlessly, crashing through the underbrush in absolute panic. Branches tore at my face, roots slick with rotten leaves, sending me stumbling, but I didn't slow. I could hear the thing crashing through the forest behind me, never tiring, always getting closer. I prayed then, as I had never prayed before. I prayed for daylight, for salvation, for this nightmarish pursuit to end. But the night only deepened, the darkness swallowing my desperate flight through the woods, and behind me, growing ever nearer, that loping, panting abomination followed, hungry for my flesh. The dense thickets of pine and hemlock blurred past me in the gloom as I fled wildly through the forest, lungs and legs burning with exertion. Behind me, the crashing footfalls of my pursuer grew louder, closer, spurring me on with the desperate energy of prey. A root caught my ankle and I went sprawling, my ankle wrenching agonizingly. I scrambled forward on hands and knees, expecting at any moment to feel hot breath on my neck, dagger-like teeth sinking into my flesh. But the monster's pursuit had fallen eerily silent. I lurched to my feet and spun around, straining my eyes to penetrate the darkness. Where had it gone? Then I glimpsed it, a hulking silhouette crouched on a nearby boulder, watching me. No, not a boulder. As the shape unfolded from its crouch, I saw with numb horror that it had been a massive fallen tree trunk. Yet the monster had blended with it seamlessly. The creature stepped into a shaft of moonlight, and I finally beheld it clearly. It towered over 8 feet tall, its form an obscene fusion of man and wolf. Ragged fur, matted with filth and old blood, sprouted from pallid, lesion-spotted skin, hands tipped with jagged black claws clenched and unclenched at its sides. But worst of all was its face, a twisted parody of human and canine features, its eyes glowing with a feral, malevolent intelligence. Frozen with terror, my voice emerged as a strangled wheeze. What are you?" The thing's jaws opened in a mockery of a smile, revealing a needle-like array of blood-crusted fangs. "Your death," it rumbled, in a growling bass that no human throat could ever produce. Then it sprang at me in a blur of matted fur and slashing claws. I stumbled backwards with a yell, fumbling for my bear spray. The stream struck the monster full in its grotesque face, and it recoiled with an ear-splitting shriek of agony. I didn't wait to see if the spray stopped it. I turned and bolted, adrenaline temporarily numbing the pain from my injured ankle. I ran until the first pale streaks of dawn lightened the eastern sky. Staggering with exhaustion, I slumped against the bole of an immense fir tree, gasping for breath. Every rustle of leaves or bird call made me flinch, my nerves scraped raw. But the creature, the aberration, seemed to have relinquished its pursuit for now. Sheer mind-blanking terror gradually ebbed, leaving me shivering and soaked with sweat. As I waited for full daylight, I struggled to process the sheer brutality of what I'd witnessed. One thing I knew for certain, that thing, that abomination, it would not stop until it had killed me. Limping onwards through the brightening forest, I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to put as much distance as possible between myself and that creature. Every rustling branch or bird call made my pulse leap into my throat, certain it had found me again. After what felt like hours, I stumbled into a small clearing and practically wept with relief. There, tucked against the tree line, was a run-down trapper's hut. Its log walls were mossy with age and the roof sagged, but it would provide some measure of shelter. The door creaked open reluctantly at my push, cobwebs drifting across my face. The single room smelled of dust and neglect, but seemed free of critters. Animal pelts, worn tattered with age, hung from the walls, the trophies of some long-gone trapper. Then my eyes fell on a rucksack dumped in the corner, half hidden under debris, a hiker's backpack, relatively new. Hands trembling, I dragged it out and opened it. The contents turned my blood to ice. A wallet with a driver's license for a young man reported missing in the park 3 months ago. A journal whose last entry spoke of being stalked by something in the woods, of tracks that made no sense, and a creeping, watching presence. The words broke off mid-sentence, the page splattered with old blood. There were other items in that hut, tucked away in the decaying remains of old crates and barrels, rotting scraps of clothing reeking of sweat and fear. A broken knife blade clogged with some black substance. And strangest of all, a dream catcher fashioned of sinew and ragged fur, the weave blackened with a dark stain. The wrongness emanating from that artifact staggered me, my head swimming with a sudden, inexplicable nausea. Dream catchers were supposed to ward off evil spirits in native lore, but this one felt like it was attracting them, like it was some kind of grisly totem or fetish empowering that monstrosity. With a mounting sense of horror, I understood then that I wasn't dealing with just some mutant predator. This thing, this dogman, it had been terrorizing these woods for a long time, preying on the unwary, decorating this hut with its grim trophies. And now I was its latest quarry, trapped out here with no hope of aid or rescue. I thought I glimpsed a hulking silhouette lurking between the pines, but maybe it was just my own paranoia. Either way, I knew with grim certainty I'd be seeing that creature again, very, very soon. I whirled as a thump sounded from the hut's roof, dislodging a shower of decayed leaves and bird droppings. A guttural growl reverberated through the weathered logs, a sound of dark hunger, of savage bloodlust. The creature was here. It had tracked me to my shabby sanctuary, and now it intended to finish the hunt. Clutching my bear spray in one badly shaking hand, I eyed the door, the single grimy window. Both looked far too flimsy to hold back the monster that pursued me. It would be on me in an instant if I tried to run. A sibilant hiss cut the air outside like steam escaping a ruptured boiler. "Ranger," the dogman crooned, its voice a guttural bass rumble no human throat could ever produce. "No escape this time. Your flesh will feed me." Gagging on terror, my eyes fell on the dream catcher, the uncanny totem that seemed to pulse with a darkness deeper than the forest shadows. An insane idea took root in my adrenaline-addled brain. If that thing was somehow tied to the abomination outside, perhaps destroying it would weaken the beast. Hands quivering, I snatched up the dream catcher, that nexus of wrongness. I had to swallow back bile at its touch, an unclean fever washing through me. Hysterical laughter burbled up my throat. What did I think this would accomplish? But I had to try something, anything to survive. The door of the hut exploded inwards in a blizzard of shattered wood, and the creature was there, blotting out the light. Its bulk filled the doorframe, its form an obscene melding of emaciated man and wolf. lips skinned back from jagged yellow fangs, matted fur bristling. It stalked towards me with a predator's unerring focus. "Scared, little man?" it growled, and to my horror, beneath the carrion reek of its breath, I caught the familiar minty scent of toothpaste. Its voice shifted, took on a mocking edge, and I recognized with numb revulsion the Chicago accent of the missing hiker whose driver's license I'd found. Dear God, it could mimic the voices of its victims. "They all scream, they all beg. You will too before the end," the dogman grated, its taloned fingers flexing. Its bulk seemed to flow like candle wax, distorting and rippling with each step. White-hot fury blazed through my veins, temporarily drowning the fear. How many innocent people had this thing slaughtered over the years? How much terror and agony had it inflicted? With a wordless howl, I hurled the dreamcatcher fetish full into the creature's face. It struck that grotesque, wolfen visage and stuck there as if magnetized, black fluid seeping from the twisted weave. The dogman recoiled with an ear-splitting shriek, its dripping claws scrabbling frantically at the thing's suction to its face. I didn't waste the chance. I charged forward and unloaded the entire can of bear spray directly into the monster's eyes. Blinded, it staggered back, still yowling as it clawed at the dreamcatcher. I snatched up a rusty propane lantern and swung it with all my strength, smashing it against the abomination's temple. The dogman crumpled, its skull fractured, yellow ichor splattering the walls. Snarling even as it fell, its talons swiped out and laid open my thigh to the bone. Fiery agony. I crashed to the floor, my blood sheeting between my fingers as I scrabbled away from its twitching bulk. The monster shuddered once and lay still, sprawled in a spreading pool of foulness. The dreamcatcher peeled away from its face and crumbled to ash. I could only pray it was truly dead. Dragging myself upright on the blood-slicked floor, I lurched for the door and the lightning sky beyond. I had to get out of that abattoir, away from the reeking corpse of the thing that had butchered so many. I stumbled into the woods, each step shooting spears of pain up my savaged leg. The trees spun around me, shock and blood loss tunneling my vision to a narrow point. Crashing to my knees in the carpet of pine needles, I fumbled in my pocket for the flare gun I always carried for emergencies. With my last strength, I fired a single red flare arching into the dawn sky. Then I toppled forward and knew no more. I awoke to the rhythmic thump of helicopter blades and the sensation of movement. Muzzily, I opened my eyes and took in a metal gurney, an IV line snaking into my arm, the uniformed paramedics hanging bags of blood. They told me later that another ranger had seen my flare and found me half dead of blood loss and shock in the forest. I babbled a fractured account of the creature, the hut full of trophies, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. They chalked it up to hallucinations brought on by my injuries and trauma. A team hiked back to the hut to retrieve the dogman's corpse, but they found only a burned-out shell, no body. Maybe it had all been in my head after all. Months later, the wounds have healed, at least physically. The claw marks scoring my thigh have faded to jagged purple scars. But the nightmares haven't stopped. I see that thing whenever I close my eyes, slavering and snarling, its fetid breath hot on my face. Some nights I wake up screaming, certain it's in the room with me. I know it wasn't a hallucination or a delusion. That thing was real, and it stalked those woods for years, preying on the innocent. I killed it, but I have a grim certainty that it wasn't the only one of its kind. Somewhere out there in the wilderness there are other dogmen prowling, hunting. I've hung up my ranger hat for good. I won't set foot in a forest again for the rest of my days. But I keep my bear spray close and sleep with a gun under my pillow. Because I know with a soul-deep dread that one night that feral crooning growl will wake me from sleep once more. It's not over, it will never be over, and it's only a matter of time before they come for me again. My name is Emily Carter, and I never believed in the supernatural. That is, until I moved to Oakwood Grove. It's a small town nestled in the Appalachian Mountains, the kind of place you'd miss if you blinked while driving through. I came here for a teaching job at the local high school, eager to escape the hustle and bustle of city life. Little did I know that this quaint town harbored secrets that would challenge everything I thought I knew about reality. Oakwood Grove seemed picture-perfect at first glance. Charming Victorian houses lined the streets, their facades well-maintained despite their age. The town square boasted a clock tower that chimed every hour, its sonorous tones echoing through the valley. The people were friendly, if a bit reserved, always ready with a smile but rarely divulging much about themselves or the town's history. I settled into a small cottage on the outskirts of town, right at the edge of the dense forest that surrounded Oakwood Grove on 3 sides. The rent was surprisingly affordable, and I soon found out why. The previous tenants had all left abruptly, citing various reasons that never quite added up, but I was too enchanted by the quaint charm of the place to pay much attention to local gossip. My first few weeks in Oakwood Grove were uneventful. I threw myself into my new job, getting to know my students and colleagues. The high school was a small, close-knit community, and I quickly felt at home there. But as autumn set in, bringing with it a perpetual mist that clung to the mountains, things began to change. It started with whispers. At first I thought it was just the wind rustling through the trees outside my cottage, but as the days grew shorter and the nights longer, the whispers became more distinct. They seemed to come from the woods, carrying words in a language I couldn't understand. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. One evening, as I was grading papers, I heard a knock at my door. It was Mrs. Henderson, my elderly neighbor. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "You've heard them too, haven't you?" she asked without preamble. "The whispers from the woods." I nodded, relieved that I wasn't going crazy, but also terrified by the confirmation that the whispers were real. Mrs. Henderson sighed, her shoulders sagging. "It's starting again," she muttered, "just like it did 30 years ago." "What's starting again?" I asked, my curiosity overcoming my fear. "Mrs. Henderson, what's going on in this town?" She looked at me for a long moment as if deciding whether or not to trust me. Finally, she spoke. "Oakwood Grove has a history, Miss Carter, a dark history that most folks here would rather forget. But the woods remember, and every so often they remind us." She went on to tell me a tale that sounded more like a horror story than local history. According to Mrs. Henderson, Oakwood Grove was built on land that once belonged to a Native American tribe. The settlers who founded the town had made a deal with the tribe's shaman, promising to respect the sacred grounds in the heart of the forest. But as the town grew, that promise was forgotten. "They built homes where they shouldn't have," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They cut down trees that had stood for centuries, and then the whispers started." She told me about a series of disappearances that had plagued the town 30 years ago. People vanishing without a trace, always on misty nights when the moon was full. The police had investigated but never found any leads. Eventually, the disappearances stopped as suddenly as they had begun, and the town tried to move on. "But now it's starting again," Mrs. Henderson said, her eyes filled with dread. "The whispers are back, and it's only a matter of time before people start disappearing again." I wanted to dismiss her story as the ramblings of a superstitious old woman, but the fear in her eyes was too real, and it matched the unease I'd been feeling since the whispers began. As Mrs. Henderson left, she turned to me one last time. "Be careful, Miss Carter. When the mist rises and the moon is full, stay inside, and whatever you do, don't answer if something calls your name from the woods." That night I lay awake in bed, Mrs. Henderson's words echoing in my mind. The whispers from the woods seemed louder than ever, and for the first time I thought I could almost make out words. They seemed to be calling, beckoning, promising secrets and wonders, if only I would step into the mist. I pulled the covers over my head, trying to block out the sound. But even in my dreams, the whispers followed me, painting visions of ancient trees and shadowy figures moving in the mist. Little did I know that this was just the beginning. The secrets of Oakwood Grove were about to unravel, and I would find myself at the heart of a mystery that had been centuries in the making. The whispers in the woods were growing louder, and soon they would be impossible to ignore. The next few weeks passed in a haze of growing unease. The whispers from the woods continued nightly, becoming more insistent as the full moon approached. I found myself jumping at shadows, constantly looking over my shoulder. My students noticed my distraction, but I brushed off their concerns with weak smiles and vague excuses about not sleeping well. It was 2 days before the full moon when the first disappearance occurred. Jenny Mathers, a bright-eyed sophomore in my English class, didn't show up for school. At first, no one thought much of it. Teenagers skip school sometimes, after all. But when she didn't come home that night, the town went into a frenzy. Search parties were organized, led by Sheriff Tom Blackwood, a gruff man with a perpetual frown. I volunteered to help, driven by a mix of concern for my student and a nagging feeling that this was somehow connected to the whispers I'd been hearing. As we combed the woods surrounding the town, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The mist hung heavy between the trees, muffling sounds and playing tricks on the eye. More than once I thought I saw shadowy figures flitting between the trunks, always just at the edge of my vision. "Miss Carter," a voice called out. I turned to see Mark Stevens, Jenny's boyfriend, and another of my students jogging towards me. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed from crying. "Any news?" I asked, already knowing the answer from his expression. He shook his head. "Nothing. It's like she just vanished." He kicked at a fallen branch in frustration. "I don't understand. Jenny loves these woods. She knows them better than anyone. How could she just disappear?" I put a comforting hand on his shoulder, wishing I had answers to give him. As we stood there, I heard it again, the whispers. They seemed to be coming from deeper in the woods, beyond where the search parties had ventured. Without thinking, I took a step in that direction. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. For a moment I thought I heard Jenny's voice among them, calling out for help. "Miss Carter?" Mark's voice snapped me back to reality. I realized I had walked several steps into the mist, away from the search party. "Are you okay?" I shook my head, trying to clear it. "Yes, I'm fine. I just thought I heard—" I trailed off, not sure how to explain what I'd experienced. Mark looked at me strangely, then his eyes widened. "You heard it too, didn't you? The whispers?" I stared at him in shock. "You've heard them?" He nodded, glancing nervously at the deepening shadows around us. "Jenny and I both have. We thought we were going crazy. She wanted to find out where they were coming from. I told her it was a bad idea, but she wouldn't listen. And now—" His voice broke, and I saw tears welling up in his eyes. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him everything would be all right. But the truth was, I was just as scared and confused as he was. As night fell, Sheriff Blackwood called off the search until morning. The woods were too dangerous in the dark, he said. But as I looked at his face in the beam of my flashlight, I saw something there that chilled me to the bone. Fear. The sheriff, a man who had lived in Oakwood Grove his entire life, was afraid of these woods. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the ever-present whispers, I made a decision. I couldn't just sit by and wait for more people to disappear. I needed answers, and I had a feeling that the key to understanding what was happening lay in Oakwood Grove's history. The next day, I went to the town library. It was a small building, its shelves crammed with books that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. The librarian, a thin, bespectacled woman named Miss Pemberley, eyed me suspiciously as I asked about books on local history. "Why the sudden interest in our town's past, Miss Carter?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated, then decided to be honest. "I've been hearing things in the woods, and with Jenny's disappearance, I just feel like there's something going on that's connected to the town's history." Miss Pemberley's face paled. For a moment I thought she was going to throw me out, but then her expression softened. "You're not the first to ask," she said softly. "Come with me." She led me to a back room filled with old documents and leather-bound books. From a locked cabinet, she pulled out a dusty tome. "This is the true history of Oakwood Grove," she said, placing it on the table in front of me. "It's not in the official records. Most people in town don't even know it exists. But if you're hearing the whispers, you need to know the truth." As I opened the book, dust motes dancing in the air around me, I had no idea that I was about to uncover secrets that would change my life forever. The whispers in the woods were growing louder, and the full moon was approaching. Time was running out, and somewhere in these pages lay the key to saving Jenny, and perhaps the entire town of Oakwood Grove. The book Miss Pemberley gave me was a revelation. Its pages were filled with handwritten accounts dating back to the founding of Oakwood Grove in the early 1800s. As I read, a picture began to emerge that was far different from the town's official history. Oakwood Grove, it turned out, was not founded by peaceful settlers looking for a new home. It was established by a group of occultists led by a man named Ezekiel Blackwood, an ancestor of the current sheriff, I realized with a start. These occultists had been drawn to this area by legends of a place where the veil between worlds was thin, where one could commune with beings from beyond our reality. The Native American tribe that had lived here, the Nahuatl, had long been guardians of this sacred place. They had rituals and safeguards in place to prevent the barrier between worlds from weakening too much, but Ezekiel and his followers saw this as an opportunity. They wanted to tear down the veil completely, to gain power from the entities on the other side. The accounts described a massacre. The Nahuatl were killed or driven off, their sacred sites desecrated. Ezekiel used their artifacts and twisted their rituals for his own purposes. He and his followers built the town directly over the most potent sites, using the energy for their dark rituals. But something went wrong. The entities they contacted were not the benevolent spirits of knowledge and power they had hoped for. They were ancient, malevolent beings that saw our world as nothing more than a new feeding ground. The veil began to tear, and things started coming through. The final entry in the book, dated 1897, was written in a shaky hand. The whispers have begun again. They call to us from the woods, promising power, knowledge, freedom from mortal constraints. But I know the truth now. I've seen what lies beyond the veil. God forgive us for what we've done. If you're reading this, heed my warning. When the mist rises and the moon is full, bar your doors. Do not listen to the whispers. Do not answer if something calls your name. And above all, do not enter the heart of the woods. What sleeps there must never be awakened. I closed the book, my mind reeling from what I'd read. It seemed impossible, like something out of a horror novel. But it explained so much. The whispers, the disappearances, the town's strange atmosphere of secrets and fear. As I left the library, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. The mist was already starting to rise from the woods, tendrils of it creeping down the streets of Oakwood Grove, and tomorrow night would be the full moon. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't just sit by with this knowledge while more people disappeared. Jenny was still out there somewhere, and maybe armed with the truth about the town's history, I could find her. But I couldn't do it alone. I needed allies, people who would believe me and help. Mark was the obvious choice. He had heard the whispers too, and he was desperate to find Jenny. And despite my initial skepticism, I found myself thinking of Mrs. Henderson. She knew more than she had told me, I was sure of it. As I walked home, plans forming in my mind, I felt the weight of the town's dark history pressing down on me. The whispers from the woods seemed louder than ever, and for the first time, I thought I could make out words clearly. Come to us, Emily. We've been waiting for you. We have so much to show you. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding. Tomorrow night, under the light of the full moon, I would venture into the heart of the woods. I would find Jenny, and I would put an end to whatever dark forces were at work in Oakwood Grove. But as the mist swirled around my feet and the whispers echoed in my ears, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into a trap centuries in the making. The secrets of Oakwood Grove were about to be revealed, and I feared the cost of that knowledge might be higher than I was prepared to pay. The next day dawned gray and misty, the sun a pale disk barely visible through the thick clouds. As I got ready for school, I couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom that hung over me. The knowledge I'd gained from the hidden history book weighed heavily on my mind. At school, the atmosphere was tense. Jenny's empty desk was a stark reminder of the danger lurking in the woods. I pulled Mark aside after class, my heart pounding as I told him what I'd discovered. To my relief, he believed me without question. I knew there was something wrong with this town, he said, his voice a mix of fear and determination. What's the plan? How do we find Jenny? I hesitated. I think we need to go into the woods tonight, during the full moon. That's when the veil between worlds is thinnest, according to the book. If Jenny's still alive, that's our best chance of finding her. Mark's face paled, but he nodded. I'm in, for Jenny. After school, I visited Mrs. Henderson. The old woman listened to my story with a grim expression, nodding occasionally as if I was confirming things she'd long suspected. I was hoping it wouldn't come to this in my lifetime, she said when I'd finished, but I suppose some secrets can't stay buried forever. She disappeared into her house for a moment, returning with a small, intricately carved wooden box. This has been passed down in my family for generations. We were tasked with protecting it, though the meaning of the task was lost over time. She opened the box, revealing a strange amulet. It was made of a dark metal I couldn't identify, inscribed with symbols that seemed to shift and change as I looked at them. This was created by the Nahuatl shamans, Mrs. Henderson explained. It's said to offer protection against the entities beyond the veil. Take it with you tonight. You're going to need all the help you can get. As the day wore on, I made my final preparations. I packed a backpack with flashlights, extra batteries, water, and some energy bars. I didn't know what to expect in the woods, but I wanted to be as prepared as possible. As night fell, I met Mark at the edge of the woods. Mrs. Henderson's amulet hung around my neck, a comforting weight against my chest. The mist was thicker than I'd ever seen it, swirling around our feet and obscuring the path ahead. Are you sure about this? Mark asked, his voice shaking slightly. I wasn't sure. Every instinct was screaming at me to turn back, to lock myself in my house and wait for morning. But I thought of Jenny, lost somewhere in these woods, and steeled my resolve. We have to do this, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. For Jenny. Mark nodded, and together we stepped into the mist-shrouded forest. The woods were eerily silent as we made our way deeper into their depths. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, casting long shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The whispers started almost immediately, a constant susurration that made it hard to concentrate. We had been walking for what felt like hours when Mark suddenly stopped. Do you hear that? He whispered. I listened intently. At first I heard nothing but the ever-present whispers. Then faintly I caught the sound of singing. It was a haunting melody, beautiful but somehow wrong, as if the notes were in a scale not meant for human ears. It's coming from over there, Mark said, pointing to a faint glow visible through the trees. As we approached, the singing grew louder. We emerged into a small clearing and froze at the sight before us. Jenny was there, along with several other people I recognized from town. They were dancing in a circle around a strange, shimmering portal that hung in the air. The portal pulsed with an unearthly light, and through it I could see glimpses of a landscape that defied description. But it was the figure standing next to the portal that truly chilled me to the bone. It was tall, at least 8 feet, with a body that seemed to be made of living shadow. Its head was adorned with antlers that branched and twisted impossibly, and its eyes glowed with an eldritch light. "Jenny," Mark called out, starting forward. I grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "Wait," I hissed. "Look at their eyes." Jenny and the others turned at the sound of Mark's voice. Their eyes were blank, pupil-less orbs that glowed with the same light as the portal. The shadowy figure turned its attention to us, and I felt the weight of its gaze like a physical force. When it spoke, its voice was like the whispers in the woods given form. "Ah, more have come to join us," it said, the words slithering into my mind. "Welcome, children of Oakwood Grove, we've been waiting for you." I clutched the amulet Mrs. Henderson had given me, feeling it grow warm against my skin. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "What have you done to them?" The creature's mouth stretched into what might have been a smile. "I am older than your kind has words for," it said. "I am the one your ancestors sought to contact, the power they hoped to harness. And now, after centuries of waiting, the veil is finally thin enough for me to come through." "Let them go," Mark said, his voice cracking with fear and anger. The creature laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Let them go?" But they came willingly. The whispers called, and they answered, just as you have. I realized with horror that it was right. We had come into the woods of our own free will, drawn by the whispers and our own curiosity, just like Jenny and the others. But the amulet was still warm against my skin, and I remembered Mrs. Henderson's words. It offered protection against the entities beyond the veil. Taking a deep breath, I held up the amulet. "By the power of those who came before," I said, the words coming to me as if from some deep ancestral memory, "I command you to release them and return to your own realm." The creature recoiled, hissing in pain or anger. The amulet flared with light, and for a moment I thought it had worked. But then the creature began to laugh again. "Brave but futile," it said. "The old magics are weak now, diluted by time and disbelief. You cannot stop what has already begun." As if on cue, the portal began to expand, tendrils of otherworldly energy reaching out into our world. Jenny and the others began to walk towards it, their movements jerky and unnatural. I knew we had to act fast. The fate of not just Jenny and the others, but possibly the entire town, maybe even the world, hung in the balance. But what could we do against a being of such power? As I stood there, frozen in indecision, I felt a change in the air. The whispers in the woods, which had been a constant presence, suddenly ceased. In the silence that followed, I heard a new sound, the beating of drums and the chanting of voices in a language I didn't recognize. The creature's head snapped up, its glowing eyes widening in what looked like fear. "No!" it hissed. "It cannot be!" From the trees around the clearing emerged a group of people dressed in traditional Native American attire. They moved with purpose, forming a circle around us and the creature. At their head was an elderly man whose eyes shone with wisdom and power. "You have trespassed long enough, Shadow Walker," the old man said, his voice ringing with authority. "It is time for you to return to your realm." The creature snarled, lashing out with tendrils of darkness, but the newcomers stood firm, their chanting growing louder. I felt the amulet grow hot again, pulsing in time with their chants. Suddenly I understood. These were the descendants of the Nahuat, the original guardians of this place. They had returned to set things right. The old man turned to me, his eyes locking with mine. "The amulet," he said. "Use it now. Speak the words your heart knows to be true." And in that moment, I did know. The knowledge flowed through me, as if the spirits of all those who had protected this land were speaking through me. I held up the amulet, its light blazing like a star. "By earth and air, by fire and water," I intoned, my voice stronger than I'd ever heard it. "By all that is and all that will be, I seal this breach. Return, Shadow Walker, to the realm beyond. The veil is restored, and you have no power here." The amulet's light expanded, enveloping the clearing. The portal began to shrink, the creature howling in rage as it was pulled back through. Jenny and the others collapsed to the ground, the unearthly glow fading from their eyes. As the light faded, I found myself on my knees, exhausted but exhilarated. Mark was helping Jenny to her feet, tears of relief streaming down his face. The Nahuat descendants moved among the townspeople, checking on them and offering words of comfort. The old man approached me, a smile crinkling his weathered face. "You have done well," he said, helping me to my feet. "The balance has been restored for now." "For now?" I asked, suddenly afraid. "You mean it could happen again?" He nodded gravely. "The veil will always be thin here. It will need guardians, always. Are you willing to take on that responsibility?" I looked around at the clearing, at Jenny and the others who were slowly coming back to themselves, at Mark who was watching me with a mixture of awe and gratitude. I thought of Oakwood Grove, of the secrets it held and the dangers it faced. "Yes," I said, feeling the weight of the decision even as I made it. "I'll do it. I'll be a guardian." The old man smiled, clasping my hand. "Then let us begin your training. There is much to learn, and the whispers in the woods never truly fall silent." As we made our way out of the forest, the first light of dawn was breaking over Oakwood Grove. The mist was dissipating, and for the first time since I'd arrived, the air felt clear and clean. I knew that life would never be the same. The veil had been lifted, and I had seen what lay beyond. But I also knew that I was no longer alone. With the wisdom of the Nahuat and the strength of the town behind me, I was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The whispers in the woods might never truly be silenced, but now, at last, I knew how to listen, and how to answer. In the years that followed, Oakwood Grove changed. The secrets that had been buried for so long came to light, and the town began to heal from centuries of fear and mistrust. I continued my work as a teacher, but now with an added responsibility. Under the tutelage of the Nawat elders, I learned the old ways of guarding the veil. Mark and Jenny, forever changed by their experiences, joined me in this sacred duty. Mrs. Henderson passed away peacefully a year after the incident in the woods, but not before sharing all she knew about the town's true history. The hidden book from the library was made public, and the town's dark past became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the importance of respecting the balance between worlds. The whispers in the woods never completely went away, but they no longer held the power to terrify. Instead, they became a reminder of the thin line we walk between realities and the importance of remaining vigilant. Oakwood Grove became known as a place of healing and wisdom. People came from far and wide to learn from the Nawat and to feel the unique energy of the forest. The town flourished, no longer haunted by its past, but embracing its role as a guardian of ancient secrets. As for me, I found a peace I never knew I was missing. In accepting my role as a guardian, I discovered a connection to the world around me that went deeper than I ever imagined possible. The woods that once terrified me became a second home, a place of power and wonder. Sometimes on quiet nights when the moon is full and the mist rises from the valley, I still hear the whispers. But now I understand them. They are not a threat, but a reminder of the delicate balance we must maintain, the ancient pact between our world and the realms beyond. And so life goes on in Oakwood Grove. We remain ever watchful, ever ready to defend the veil. For in this small town nestled in the mountains, the ordinary and the extraordinary walk hand in hand, and the whispers in the woods tell stories of worlds beyond our own, waiting just beyond the veil.